All right, and we're live. If you're watching this not live, look below. There'll be the little chapter markers, and I'll let you know when the content starts. But I'm just gonna hang out for about 10 minutes. So if you're here, thank you. I saw some live comments. Some of the people who sat through most of that freaking 2 hours we did the other day. But again, chapters below. If you're not watching this live, I'll put it in when the book starts. This is part two. It's probably going to take like four parts. I don't know if I'm going to go 8 hours again, but I don't see why not. So, let me just make sure this is up on Twitter. I'm going to share a post as well. And what's up? How you guys doing? This is a racist book, apparently. And really, like the question of is the book racist is like, what the hell does that mean? Especially when you're talking about a book that is like being used as evidence. It's the evidence as individual pieces is still the evidence. You still evaluate the authenticity of it and its relevance to whatever argument you're making. But I don't understand this argument. I mean, I understand it, but the way I understand it is that it's not an argument that's meant to have a constructive conversation. It's an argument that's meant to disparage someone else. In this case, Graham Hancock, with his association with a book that is perceived to be racist. But we did find near the end, about 6 hours in, that there was a part that I personally thought was, no value judgment on it. I do have a value judgment on it. I don't like racism personally, but like it was, whether you like racism or not, it was a racist thing. He was talking about like the inherent qualities of a race of people, and that's like textbook racism. Yeah, Paul, that makes sense. We had a lot. Yeah, it was 8 hours, Vingal. This is going to take like 30 something hours, I think. No, actually, not that much. Less than 30. I'm not sure if the third part is shorter, but yeah, it was the longest stream I've ever had. But people liked it, so why not do it again? And it's really low. I don't want to say low effort because it's not like it's low effort. It's still 8 hours, especially near the end of that. But I'm able to go for a longer period of time if I'm not interacting as often. So it's like there's less of me saying stuff. And it's like, if I have to talk the whole time, I can't monologue for more than an hour and a half, 2 hours. If I'm doing like articles or something, videos is like 4 hours, but this is, this is good. And this is different than videos too, because with videos, like if I'm watching someone's YouTube video, I couldn't like in good conscience and copyright just let their stuff play. That would be immoral. Yeah, if you're just joining us, we're gonna get started in a few minutes. I just let people come in. Yeah, and that's my take on it. Like and when I'm saying like actual racist, like I get it. You can identify, shared characteristics of a group based on any number of factors, race being one of them. You can identify it on like place of origin, whether that be a country or a local area, religion. I mean, you can identify it on anything. Height, like there's any number of things you can. But if you see an individual and regardless of the evidence presented to you by their personal behavior as an individual, and decide that because of the color of their skin that they are something, even with evidence to the contrary, then yeah, that's dumb. That's a low IQ take, I think. But and that's what I'm thinking of as racism. Today, racism is like they call me racist because, I even actually John Hoops called me racist or said I was doing a racist thing. I'm sure John Hoops, who is Flint Dibble's buddy over there, he said I was doing a racist thing because I brought up the low IQs and SAT scores of teachers compared to other college graduates. And like the way I hear that, and the way when he says that, I'm talking about teachers. I looked it up to confirm this, but I knew that like that teachers were very disproportionately white, but they're very disproportionately white. If I'm remembering correctly, it was like 80%. Um, and that's like one of the it is one of the lowest IQ professions or college degrees really, but it's pretty one to one for teachers. And then of course there's selection, but that's just not what we're talking about. Um, th- they were one of the most like top 5 degrees for being low IQ, like top lowest 5 IQs average for majors, and then top 5 also for percentage of white people. So like to me, John Hoops just looked at that tweet, saw IQ, and when he sees the word IQ, he immediately thinks low IQ. Or when he sees low IQ, his first thought is black people, which that's racist. Like I think personally, John Hoops is racist. But you know, whatever. That's fine, John. You can have your personal beliefs. You can be prejudiced. You're allowed to. This is America. Um, okay, I'm. It's locked. Oh, that sucks. Um, well, yeah, I'm glad the hurricane went okay. Um, doesn't seem to be as bad as they were expecting it to be. All right, we're going to start here in a second with part 2 of this. Just a few more minutes, let people come in, and then we're going to start with the second part of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Um, what's going on with the chat? The comments are weird. Yeah, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Again, if you didn't watch part 1, that's fine. These are like different. They're like the different chapters are like different concepts. But this is a book that Flint Dibble called Racist. I already talked about how I don't think that really like it's not important to me whether the character of the book itself is racist. I personally feel that like I don't know, like some of the stuff we read was racist. Oh no, Vingle, I'm sorry. I'm not saying your comments are weird. What I'm saying is my like the way they're displaying on my stream, like some of them aren't displaying and they're displaying over each other. It's not. I didn't mean that your comments were weird. I'm sorry. But they're not all coming up and they're like the UI is glitched. Give me a second on that. But a few more minutes, people are going to come in. Oh, and I have to use a different um the whole internet Wayback Machine archive, like internet whatever. It's all down. It's all down, and that's what I was using for this. But this is open source anyway. It's like it's anything before 1921, 18, something around there is copyright free for books. The rules changed. Now it's like 70 years after the death of the author, unfortunately. But um, yeah, I'd love to do some newer stuff. Yeah, Vingle, I was trying to figure out what you were saying, but because the comments are like over each other, I can't even read the text. Okay, I'm going to make a post on Twitter with the thumbnail saying we're here, and then I'm going to figure out my comments, and then we're going to start this. I'm going to have to find my spot in it. Oh, and I'm going to need to make sure that the audio is going okay. Okay. Um. Oh, what the heck happened? Ooh, Billy Strings is live right now. I cannot get distracted by that, but I do love Billy Strings. Um, to... That's what I want. Okay. It's coming in. It's not working on StreamYard, but it's coming in fine on... It's coming in fine on actual YouTube native. All right. Cool. Let me just drop a good morning. Where's everybody from again? I love hearing that. I forget sometimes where people are from. Obviously, Florida for Big Yehuda. I lost my tab. I'm not built for this, man. This is not, it's not somebody with ADHD having to juggle. Everybody's got ADHD, I guess, but yeah, Vingle, I remember where you're from. I think. Fayetteville, Arkansas. Fantastic. I went to Arkansas. Yes, I did remember that you were from Australia. Yeah, our Turkish friend is not here. It's getting later for him. He might pop in. Yeah, okay. I did think you were Norwegian. I didn't want to guess like Denmark. It's one of those places. There's a Serbian guy that comes in sometimes, and when I first saw him in there, I was like, I want to guess that you're Serbian, but if you're Bosnian, I'm going to get like a gypsy curse on me or something. What's up, Vulpus? Good to see you. Oh, gosh. Oh, I can edit it right here. Oh, I didn't even know that. Oh my gosh, I've been doing that way worse. Okay. So 12 minutes is when we're going to start. This is part, okay. Sorry. Oh, am I still up? Did it just drop? Okay, cool. You see me? Okay, I'm here. All right. It just dropped on that thing. Like the video, please. And we are going to start, and then I'm going to find the place in the new book because we can't use archive. Also, tell me how the sound is. Oh, am I still here? It's like my internet's down.
17.
Okay. I think I'm here. Tell me how the audio is of my voice versus the audio.
Part 3, Chapter 2. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by...
Okay, what's happening though? Why is this not playing?
Ignatius Loyola Donnelly.
What's up, Fabian? Good to see you, brother. Okay, it's perfect. Sounds good. All right. Now, the reading... Why is it buffering?
17, Part 3, Chapter 2.
Okay.
Atlantis, the Antediluvian...
Oh, it keeps buffering. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what's happening. And that's buffering too. Ugh. What the heck?
World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Recording by Mike Harris.
Yeah, I love Mike Harris. This pause is normal. That's a good idea, Vingle. I don't know why I didn't do that. It's a simple audio file as well. The video's still going. They just have some blank spaces between.
Section 18, Part 3,
Okay.
Chapter 3
This is like a German woman. That's different.
of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly.
Oh, no.
This is a
Or
LibriVox
French.
recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For
This is
more
like
information
ASMR,
or to
bro.
volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 3. American Evidences of Intercourse with Europe or Atlantis.
Oh, why should
1.
she say intercourse, man?
On the monuments of Central America, there are representations of bearded men. How could the beardless American Indians have imagined a bearded race? 2. All the traditions of the civilized races of Central America point to an Eastern origin. The leader and civilizer of the Nahua family was Quetzalcoatl. This is the legend respecting him. From the distant East, from the fabulous Huhu-Tlapalan, this mysterious person came to Tula and became the patron god and high priest of the ancestors of the Toltecs. He is described as having been a white man with strong formation of body, broad forehead, large eyes, and flowing beard. He wore a mitre on his head and was dressed in a long white robe reaching to his feet and covered with red crosses. In his hand he held a sickle. His habits were ascetic, he never married, was most chaste and pure in life, and is said to have endured penance in a neighboring mountain, not for its effects upon himself, but as a warning to others. He condemned sacrifices, except of fruits and flowers, and was known as the god of peace. For, when addressed on the subject of war, he is reported to have stopped his ears with his fingers. The North Americans of antiquity, he was skilled in many arts. He invented, that is, imported, gem-cutting and metal casting. He originated letters and invented the Mexican calendar. He finally returned to the land in the east from which he came. Leaving the American coast at Vera Cruz, he embarked in a canoe made of serpent skins and sailed away into the east.
She sounds like...
Repeat, page 271. Dr. Le Plongeon says of the columns...
Oh my gosh, when she says French words. Yeah, I think you guys can tell. I don't even have to say anything. Yes, that's an attractive voice. I was going to say, now I feel stupid saying it, but she sounds like that French woman from Rush Hour 2. Great movie. Love that series. I am a sucker for a buddy cop movie.
At Chichen, the base is formed by the head of Kukulkan, the shaft of the body of the serpent, with its feathers beautifully carved to the very chapiter. On the chapiters of the columns that support the portico, at the entrance of the castle in Chichen Itza, may be seen the carved figures of long-bearded men with upraised hands in the act of worshipping sacred trees. They forcibly recall to mind the same worship in Assyria. In the accompanying cut of an ancient vase from Tula, we see a bearded figure grasping a beardless man.
I did not enjoy Retainer
In the cut
Girl.
given below, we see a face that might be duplicated among the old men of any part of Europe. The Kakshikal MS says,
I think it's kind of nice hearing
4
different
persons
voices
came
for
from
the
Tulan,
audiobook. What do you guys
from
think?
the direction of the rising sun. That is one Tulan. There is another Tulan in Xibal Bay, and another where the sun sets, and it is there that we came. And in the direction of the setting sun there is another, where is the god, so that there are 4 Tulans, and it is where the sun sets that we came to Tulan from the other side of the sea, where this Tulan is, and it is there that we were conceived and begotten by our mothers and fathers. That is to say, the birthplace of the race was in the east, across the sea, at a place called Tulan, and when they emigrated they called their first stopping place on the American continent Tulan also, and besides this, there were 2 other Tulans. Of the Nahua predecessors of the Toltecs...
I want to talk about this comment for a second. Doesn't sound like a god, more like a revered man who taught the indigenous things. So this is something that comes up a lot, and it's relevant to a bunch of different things. It's very relevant to me, to the... to some of the arguments that Flint has made. He's made the argument that it's ridiculous that the people would see a white guy and be like, oh my gosh, it's a god. And I think Flint knows this, but this is, and archaeologists know this, but they're being a little disingenuous. Maybe they just haven't thought about it in this way. But in like animistic and shamanistic societies, like, the idea of energy that permeates all things is extraordinarily common. So in a lot of these cultures, and you can find this on every continent, the concept of mana. I usually just go with Star Wars and say it's like midichlorians. Like different people have different amounts of midichlorians. The midichlorians are the force incarnate, and different people have different levels of them. It's like your life force. And this is why like there's things like cannibalism. Like ritualistic cannibalism isn't about actually needing food. It's about like wanting to consume the life force of somebody for some sort of spiritual power. And it's in a lot of cultures, including a lot of Eastern Woodlands Native Americans, this is, and I say a lot just because I don't know if it's all of them really, but this is so common. I know for a fact it's with a lot of Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands. It's probably pervasive pretty much everywhere else in North America, as well as in Europe prior to like monotheism. So people in their own society, like, you know that the Aztec emperor is a god king, and it's not like he's the only one that's ever existed. There's in the world, I mean, even as late as the 1600s, you have Louis the Sun King, which is like just a step away from God King. You have the pharaohs, like God Emperor type stuff. This is common. Like, it's, of course, the leader of a group of men who shows up on a ship that you've never seen before. People are going to think that they like somebody who sees them living in a hunter-gatherer civilization. This obviously doesn't apply to the Mayans and the Aztecs, but with the Aztecs, they also have that concept in them because, you know, they have like the god emperor, Montezuma of the Aztecs, who has like this spiritual power in them. So it's not like, oh, this is the one true Christian God. This is the one God. This is like, oh, this guy is a very powerful man. And I think parts of that are being lost in translation and a misunderstanding over time. And also people making bad faith arguments. It's not crazy. It makes perfect sense. Of course, they're going to think that guy is a god or imbued with in excess of spiritual energy if he's the war leader of a group of men that showed up on a massive machine. Like, that's the most normal thing. If they didn't think that, it would be weird. And we have modern examples of hunter-gatherers seeing this. Like, there's a tribe in Papua New Guinea that worshipped Prince Philip. I know that that's a very common thing to talk about in relation to anthropology, but it's also true. Prince Philip died. Now Charles, yes, cargo cults. And anthropology today, I've seen articles from anthropologists who are like, we shouldn't like be calling it a cargo cult. That's racist somehow. I don't know. I don't care. So I didn't look into why. I don't care when, look, if a black person tells me that something's racist and I know them, then yeah, I'm going to hear what they have to say. I don't care when white people say something's racist. I just don't. I don't care. You're white. And I don't mean white's bad. You know what I mean. I hope you know what I mean. Freaking academics speaking up for minorities all the time. Yes, if you and I walked into a simple hunter-gathering community and started shooting off pistols and talking on cell phones, they would call us something like a god. Yeah, because any technology that's advanced enough is like magic. And I did a thread on this that I need to rework. But it's the most reasonable thing. And even when you hang out with them for a while and explain it to them, like, oh yeah, we have these things called factories, phones, schools. Every single thing is foreign to them. It's completely outside of their understanding of the world. So they're not gonna, wait a minute. I do not want to be Richard Dawkins. Wait, who's Richard Dawkins? Am I remembering that right? I don't want to be like an atheist is what I'm saying. It doesn't mean they're stupid. Number one, they have no frame of reference for it. There's no frame of reference for a factory that created all these things. There's too many things that had to happen in a line, and you can't just explain those things. So people are going to understand it in the concept of their own culture. And so, yeah, some people thought that Prince Philip was a god. So this idea, I don't know if I necessarily believe that this was like a white god that came down. And I don't even know if I necessarily believe that the Aztecs really thought that he was a god. That seems kind of up in the air, and that might have been added in. Flint could be correct on that. I'm not sure. But what I do know is if Flint's right about that, it doesn't make Graham Hancock racist. It doesn't make the argument racist. But I'm just not sure what the actual truth is. I think it's believable either way. But the concept, the idea that a white person shows up on a shore with darker skinned people, and I'm not saying it couldn't happen the other way. I'm just saying that this is the specific scenario that we're discussing. Then when he land, like, that's happened. We have that happening in cargo cults in the modern world, and we have like recordings of interviews with the actual people who say that the white guy's the god. So what are we talking about? Yeah. There's a group of people that worship a small plane because the CIA used to use their island to traffic coke. I've never heard of that. I've only heard about these in the context of Melanesia, but I'll have to look into that. I need to get back. I went on a long rant.
In Mexico, the Olmecs and Xicalaucans were the most important. They were the forerunners of the great races that followed. According to Ixtlilxochitl, these people, which are conceded to be one, occupied the world in the Third Age. They came from the east in ships or barks to the land of Potonchan, which they commenced to populate.
I wish why is there no citation on
The
that?
Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg, in one of the notes of the introduction of the Popol Vuh, presents a very remarkable analogy between the kingdom of Xibalba, described in that work, and Atlantis. He says, "Both countries are magnificent, exceedingly fertile, and abound in the precious metals. The empire of Atlantis was divided into 10 kingdoms, governed by 5 couples of twin sons of Poseidon, the eldest being supreme over the others, and the 10 constituted a tribunal that managed the affairs of the empire. Their descendants governed after them. The 10 kings of Xibalba, who reigned, in couples, under Huncame and Vucubcame, and who together constituted a grand council of the kingdom, certainly furnish curious points of comparison. And there is wanting neither a catastrophe, for Xibalba had a terrific inundation, nor the name of Atlas, of which the etymology is found only in the Nahuatl tongue. It comes from Atl, water, and we know that a city of Atlan, near the water, still existed on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama at the time of the conquest. In Yucatan the traditions all point to an eastern and foreign origin for the race. The early writers report that the natives believe their ancestors to have crossed the sea by a passage which was open for them. Lendas Relación, page 28. It was also believed that part of the population came into the country from the west. Lizana says that the smaller portion, the little descent, came from the east, while the greater portion, the great descent, came from the west. Cogoluda considers the eastern colony to have been the larger. The culture hero Zamna,
I just want to speculate. The Clovis First is done, right? It has been for a long time, but the Kelp Highway hypothesis is the idea that people came on boats over like shallow waters. And that hypothesis, so there's definitely multiple groups of people over time that came to the Americas, but it's possible that they didn't just come from the West. They also could have come from the East. And I mean, that's an idea. And I don't know, there's not as much evidence for that. There's not much of any, but the Eastern thing could just be people coming from like Greenland down, doing something similar. Who knows? But that's how that reads to me. That's the most like reasonable explanation if we have to put a real world example on that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people traveling across the ocean. It could just be the eastern and then southern, but like the eastern from the east to the west journey would have been the worst one.
Of all civilization in Yucatan is described as the teacher of letters and the leader of the people from their ancient home. He was the leader of a colony from the east. The North Americans of Antiquity, page 229. The ancient Mexican legends say that, after the flood, Coxcox and his wife, after wandering 104 years, landed at Antlan, and passed thence to Capultepec, and thence to Culhuacan, and lastly to Mexico. Coming from Atlantis, they named their first landing place Antlan. All the races that settled Mexico, we are told, traced their origin back to an Aztlan, Atlantis. Duran describes Aztlan as a most attractive land. The North Americans of Antiquity, page 257. Same, the great name of Brazilian legend, came across the ocean from the rising sun. He had power over the elements and tempests. The trees of the forest would recede to make room for him, cutting down the trees. The animals used to crouch before him, domesticated animals. Lakes and rivers became solid for him, boats and bridges. And he taught the use of agriculture and magic. Like him, Bochica, the great lawgiver of the Muiscas, and son of the sun, he who invented for them the calendar and regulated their festivals, had a white beard, a detail in which all the American culture heroes agree. The Same of Brazil was probably the Samna of Yucatan. 4. We find in America numerous representations of the elephant. We are forced to one of two conclusions. Either the monuments date back to the time of the mammoth in North America, or these people held intercourse at some time in the past with the races who possessed the elephant, and from whom they obtained pictures of that singular animal. Plato tells us that the Atlanteans possessed great numbers of elephants. There are in Wisconsin a number of mounds of earth representing different animals, men, birds, and quadrupeds.
Fortunately, some of those
Among
were
the latter
bulldozed.
is a mound representing an elephant, so perfect in its proportions and complete in its representation of an elephant, that its builders must have been well acquainted with all the physical characteristics of the animal which they delineated. We copy the representation of this mound on page 168. On a farm in Louisa County, Iowa, a pipe was ploughed up, which also represents an elephant. We are indebted to the valuable work of John T. Short, The North Americans of Antiquity, page 530, for a picture of this singular object. It was found in a section where the ancient mounds were very abundant and rich in relics. The pipe is of sandstone, of the ordinary mound builder's type, and has every appearance of age and usage. There can be no doubt of its genuineness. The finder had no conception of its archaeological value. In the ruined city of Palenque we find, in one of the palaces, a stucco bas-relief of a priest. His elaborate headdress or helmet represents very faithfully the head of an elephant. The cut on page 169 is from a drawing made by Waldeck. The decoration known as elephant trunks is found in many parts of the ancient ruins of Central America, projecting from above the doorways of the buildings. In Tyler's Researches into the Early History of Mankind, page 313, I find a remarkable representation of an elephant, taken from an ancient Mexican manuscript. It is as follows. End of chapter 3.
Part 3, Chapter 4, Section 19
Who
of
the heck is
Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly.
this guy? Oh, this is
a
just on
LibriVox
YouTube.
recording. All
It's a
LibriVox
LibriVox
recordings are in
recording,
the
but
public
it's on
domain.
YouTube.
For more information or to volunteer,
From their YouTube
please visit
channel, actually.
LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 3, The Civilization of the Old World and New Compared. Chapter 4, Section 19. Corroborating Circumstances. 1. Lenormant insists that the human race issued from Ups Meru, and adds that some Greek traditions point to this locality, particularly the expression me Oropsa now poi, which can only mean the men sprung from Meru. Manual, page 21. Theopompus tells us that the people who inhabited Atlantis were the Meropes, the people of Meru. 2. Whence comes the word Atlantic? The dictionaries tell us that the ocean is named after the mountains of Atlas. But whence did the Atlas Mountains get their name? The words Atlas and Atlantic have no satisfactory etymology in any language known to Europe. They are not Greek, and cannot be referred to any known language of the Old World. But in the Nahuatl language we find immediately the radical a, atl, which signifies water, war, and the top of the head. Molina, Vocabulary and Lingua Mexicana y Castellana. From this comes a series of words, such as Atlan, on the border of or amid the water, from which we have the adjective Atlantic. We have also Atlaca, to combat, or Atlasa, or be in agony. It means likewise to hurl or dart from the water, and in the preterit makes Atlaz. A city named Atlan existed when the continent was discovered by Columbus at the entrance of the Gulf of Uraba in Darien. With a good harbor, it is now reduced to an unimportant pueblo named Acla. This from Baldwin's Ancient America, page 179. Plato tells us that Atlantis and the Atlantic Ocean were named after Atlas, the eldest son of Poseidon, the founder of the kingdom. 3. Upon that part of the African continent nearest to the site of Atlantis, we find a chain of mountains known from the most ancient times as the Atlas Mountains. Whence this name Atlas, if it be not from the name of the great king of Atlantis? And if this be not its origin, how comes it that we find it in the most northwestern corner of Africa? And how does it happen that in the time of Herodotus there dwelt near this mountain chain a people called the Atlantes, probably a remnant of a colony from Solon's Island? How comes it that the people of the Barbary States were known to the Greeks, Romans, and Carthaginians as the Atlantes, this name being especially applied to the inhabitants of Fezzan and Bilma? Where did they get the name from? There is no etymology for it east of the Atlantic Ocean. Lenormant's Ancient History of the East, page 253. Look at it. An Atlas mountain on the shore of Africa, an Atlan town on the shore of America, the Atlantes living along the north and west coast of Africa, an Aztec people from Aztlan in Central America, an ocean rolling between the two worlds called the Atlantic, a mythological deity called Atlas holding the world on his shoulders, and an immemorial tradition of an island of Atlantis. Can all these things be the result of accident? 4. Plato says that there was a passage west from Atlantis to the rest of the islands, as well as from these islands to the whole opposite continent that surrounds the real sea. He calls it a real sea, as contradistinguished from the Mediterranean, which, as he says, is not a real sea or ocean, but a landlocked body of water like a harbor. Now, Plato might have created Atlantis out of his imagination, but how could he have invented the islands beyond, the West India Islands, and the whole continent, America, enclosing that real sea? If we look at the map, we see that the continent of America does surround the ocean in a great half circle. Could Plato have guessed all this? If there had been no Atlantis, and no series of voyages from it that revealed the half circle of the continent from Newfoundland to Cape St. Roche, how could Plato have guessed it? And how could he have known that the Mediterranean was only a harbor compared with the magnitude of the great ocean surrounding Atlantis? Long sea voyages were necessary to establish that fact.
Yes, that's the idea.
And the Greeks, who kept close to the shores in their short journeys, did not make such voyages. 5. How can we, without Atlantis, explain the presence of the Basques in Europe, who have no lingual affinities with any other race on the continent of Europe, but whose language is similar to the languages of America? Plato tells us that the dominion of Gadeirus, one of the kings of Atlantis, extended toward the Pillars of Hercules, as far as the country which is still called the region of Gades in that part of the world. Gades is the Cadiz of today, and the dominion of Gadeirus embraced the land of the Iberians, or Basques, their chief city taking its name from a king of Atlantis, and they themselves being Atlanteans. Dr. Farrar, referring to the Basque language, says, What is certain about
The Basques are like pre-Indo-European. They're one of like it's like pre-Indo-European is basically just the Basques and the Sardinians. I'm sure there's other pockets, but those are the only ones that have survived in any sort of significant genetic and cultural sense, including their languages. So that's interesting. I'd like to hear what modern linguists have to say about that
it
connection.
is that its structure is
Like the Welsh thing, I thought was crazy. I like there was connections if you guys weren't here with the Welsh language in the last one.
polysynthetic, like the languages of America. Like them, it forms its compounds by the elimination of certain radicals in the simple words, so that Ilhun, the twilight, is contracted from Hill, dead, and Egan, day, and Belhar, the knee, from Belhar, front, and Oin, leg. The fact is indisputable, and is eminently noteworthy, that while the affinities of the Basque roots have never been conclusively elucidated, there has never been any doubt that this isolated language, preserving its identity in a western corner of Europe between two mighty kingdoms, resembles in its grammatical structure the aboriginal languages of the vast opposite continent, America, and those alone. Families of Speech, page 132. If there was an Atlantis, forming with its connecting ridges a continuous
Yes, there's plenty of admixture of pre-Indo-European people, pretty much everywhere, but and at varying degrees in certain populations. But I'm talking about like really the language is very much tied to the culture, so the language surviving and a more significant part of the genetics, not necessarily that like the language can be moved into a population without the genetics changing, which is true of like Hungarians.
bridge of land from America to Africa, we can understand how the Basques could have passed from one continent to another. But if the wide Atlantic rolled at all times unbroken between the two continents,
I'm going to mute
it's
those
difficult
again.
to conceive of such an emigration by an uncivilized people. 6. Without Atlantis, how can we explain the fact that the early Egyptians were depicted by themselves as red men on their own monuments? And on the other hand, how can we account for the representations of Negroes on the monuments of Central America? Desiree Charnay, now engaged in exploring those monuments, has published in the North American Review for December, 1880, photographs of a number of idols exhumed
Right, he's talking about
at
the
San
Olmec
Juan de
heads here.
Teotihuacan,
I don't
from which
know.
I select the
People
following
had different
strikingly
thoughts
Negroid
on it.
faces. Negro idols found in Mexico. Dr. Le Plongeon says, besides the sculptures of long-bearded men seen by the explorer at Chichen Itza, there were tall figures of people with small heads, thick lips, and curly short hair or wool, regarded as Negroes. We always see them as standard or parasol bearers, but never engaged in actual warfare. Maya Archaeology, page 62. The following cut is from the court of the palace of Palenque, figured by Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really know, but it's the nose does look quite Bantu to me, but I don't think that even that would be like people take artistic choices, right? I they probably are. They probably are just freaking they probably are just their own people. But they were very into this stuff at the time. It's worth an argument, but even if it doesn't say that much. I don't know.
The face is strongly Ethiopian. The figure below represents a gigantic granite head found near the volcano of Tuxtla, below figured by Stevens. The face is strongly Ethiopian.
What?
The figure below represents a gigantic granite head found near the volcano of Tuxtla
Okay, but we don't have
in the
any
Mexican
images.
state of Veracruz at Caxapa. The features are unmistakably Negroid. As the Negroes have never been a
Yeah, someone's told me. Someone's told. I just don't care enough. I guess. Like I'm just not that interested because I don't think that it's like, it's not even provable that you know, you can argue about what they look like all you want, but even if like it doesn't, there's there's nothing to do after that. We don't know. And even if like, and what I'm saying is, even if like they definitely were Bantu Africans. It doesn't. I don't know. It's just it's there's nothing like of substance in that argument. If we were able to confirm it, we would have other information. Confirm it one way or the other, we would have other information that would be more important, regardless. But whatever. Yeah.
A seafaring race, the presence of these faces among the antiquities of Central America proves one of two things: either the existence of a land connection between America and Africa via Atlantis, as revealed by the deep-sea soundings of the Challenger, or commercial relations between America and Africa through the ships of the Atlanteans, or some other civilized race, whereby the Negroes were brought to America as slaves at a very remote epoch. And we find some corroboration of the latter theory in that singular book of the Quiches.
Yes, thank you. That is exactly what I was trying to get out, that I couldn't get out that concisely. That is what I was saying.
Popol Vuh, in which, after describing the creation of the first men in the region of the rising sun, Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 5, page 548, and enumerating their first generations, we are told, all seem to have spoken one language, and to have lived in great peace, black men and white together. Here they awaited the rising of the sun, and prayed to the heart of heaven. Bancroft's Native Races, page 547. How did the red men of Central America know anything about black men and white men? The conclusion seems inevitable that these legends of a primitive, peaceful, and happy land, an Aztlan in the east, inhabited by black and white men, to which all the civilized nations of America traced their origin, could only refer to Atlantis, that bridge of land where the white, dark, and red races met. The Popol Vuh proceeds to tell how this first home of the race became overpopulous, and how the people under Balam Kitse migrated, how their language became confounded, in other words, broken up into dialects.
Yes, and this was a point I made when we did the live stream. It's like it's Flint Dibble was like, I don't identify statues like that, man. Like he like acted all indignant about it. He was like, what kind of face does that look like? You can identify phenotypes. People look different. It's okay. It's fine. But then he like brought up like it was a codex, like it was a drawing or a painting. And then he was identifying the race based on that, which I thought was hilarious.
In consequence of separation, and how some of the people went to the east, and many came hither to Guatemala. Ibid, page 547. M. A. de Quatrefages, Human Species, page 200, says, black populations have been found in America in very small numbers only, as isolated tribes in the midst of very different populations. Such are the Charruas of Brazil, the black Caribbees of St. Vincent in the Gulf of Mexico, the Jamasi of Florida, and the dark-complexioned Californians. Such, again, is the tribe that Balboa saw some representatives of in his passage of the Isthmus of Darien in 1513. They were true Negroes. 7. How comes it that all the civilizations of the Old World radiate from the shores of the Mediterranean? The Mediterranean is a cul-de-sac, with Atlantis opposite its mouth. Every civilization on its shores possesses the traditions that point to Atlantis. We hear of no civilization coming to the Mediterranean from Asia, Africa, or Europe, from north, south, or west. But north, south, east, and west, we find civilization radiating from the Mediterranean to other lands. We see the Aryans descending upon Hindustan from the direction of the Mediterranean, and we find the Chinese borrowing inventions from Hindustan and claiming descent from a region not far from the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has been the center of the modern world because it lay in the path of the extension of an older civilization whose ships colonized its shores, as they did also the shores of America. Plato says, the nations are gathered around the shores of the Mediterranean like frogs around a marsh. Dr. McCausland says, the obvious conclusion from these facts is that at some time previous to these migrations, a people speaking a language of a superior and complicated structure broke up their society, and, under some strong impulse, poured out in different directions, and gradually established themselves in all the lands now inhabited by the Caucasian race. Their territories extend from the Atlantic to the Ganges, and from Iceland to Ceylon, and are bordered on the north and east by the Asiatic Mongols, and on the south by the Negro tribes of Central Africa. They present all the appearances of a later race, expanding itself between and into the territories of two pre-existing neighboring races, and forcibly appropriating the room required for its increasing population. McCausland's Adam and the Adamites, page 280. Modern civilization is Atlantean. Without the thousands of years of development which were had in Atlantis, modern civilization could not have existed. The inventive faculty of the present age is taking up the great delegated work of creation, where Atlantis left it thousands of years ago. 8. How are we to explain the existence of the Semitic race in Europe without Atlantis? It's an intrusive race, a race colonized on seacoasts.
Wait,
Where are its...
does anyone know what he means by Semitic race in Europe? Existence of the Semitic race. Who is he referring to? I know that, like that. I know anti-Semitic today. That it's Jewish people, but that's not really what it means, and that's not what it would have meant in the 1880s. No, is it the Jews in the 1880s? Is it already? Is that? I guess he's talking about in Europe, so he's probably not talking about Arabs. I don't. What does that have to do with this, though? Everybody, maybe Sicilians. All right, that's fine.
Old world affinities. 9.
Oh,
Why is it that the origin of wheat, barley, oats, maize, and rye, the essential plants of civilization, is totally lost in the mists of a vast antiquity? We have in the Greek mythology legends of the introduction of most of these by Atlantean kings or gods into Europe, but no European nation claims to have discovered or developed them, and it has been impossible to trace them to their wild originals. Out of the whole flora of the world, mankind in the last 7,000 years has not developed a single food plant to compare in importance to the human family with these. If a wise and scientific nation should propose nowadays to add to this list, it would have to form great botanical gardens, and by systematic and long-continued experiments develop useful plants from the humble productions of the field and forest. Was this done in the past on the island of Atlantis? 10. Why is it that we find in Ptolemy's Geography of...
so so I guess he's talking about Jews, but like, I don't understand why it's confusing that they're in Europe. Like they could have just walked there. I don't understand. Whatever.
Of Asia Minor, in a list of cities in
A lot of
Armenia
stuff in this
Major
book doesn't
in
make
AD
sense.
140, the names of 5 cities, which have their counterparts in the names of localities in Central America. The Armenian cities are Chol, Kalowa, Zuivana, Cholima, and Zalisa. The Central American localities are Cholula, Coloacan, Zuivan, Colima, and Xalisco. Short's North Americans of Antiquity, page 497. 11. How comes it that the sandals upon the feet of the statue of Chacmal, discovered at Chichen Itza, are exact representations of those found on the feet of the Guanches, the early inhabitants of the Canary Islands, whose mummies are occasionally discovered in the eaves of Tenerife? Dr. Merritt deems the axe or chisel heads dug up at Chiriqui, Central America, to be almost identical in form as well as material with specimens found in Suffolk County, England. Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 4, page 20. The rock carvings of Chiriqui are pronounced by Mr. Seaman to have a striking resemblance to the ancient incised characters found on the rocks of Northumberland, England. Ibid. Some stones have recently been discovered in Hierro and Los Palmos, the Canary Islands, bearing sculptured symbols similar to those found on the shores of Lake Superior, and this has led M. Berthollet, the historiographer of the Canary Islands, to conclude that the first inhabitants of the Canaries and those of the Great West were one in race. Benjamin, The Atlantic Islands, page 130. 12. How comes it that very high authority, Professor Retzius, Smithsonian Report, 1859, page 266, declares, with regard to the primitive dolichocephali of America, I entertain a hypothesis still more bold, namely, that they are nearly related to the Guanches in the Canary Islands, and to the Atlantic populations of Africa, the Moors, Tuareg, Copts, etc., which Latham comprises under the name of Egyptian Atlantidae. We find one and the same form of skull in the Canary Islands, in front of the African coast, and in the Carib Islands on the opposite coast, which faces Africa. The color of the skin on both sides of the Atlantic is represented in these populations as being of a reddish brown. 13. The barbarians, who are alluded to by Homer and Thucydides, were a race of ancient navigators and pirates called Caries or Carians, who occupied the Isles of Greece before the Pelasgi, and antedated the Phoenicians in the control of the sea. The Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg claims that these Carians were identical with the Caribs of the West Indies, the Caras of Honduras, and the Guarani of South America. Landa's Relation, pages 52 to 65. 14. When we consider it closely, one of the most extraordinary customs ever known to mankind is that to which I have already alluded in a preceding chapter, to wit, the embalming of the body of the dead man, with a purpose that the body itself may live again in a future state. To arrive at this practice, several things must coexist. A. The people must be highly religious and possessed of an organized and influential priesthood to perpetuate so troublesome a custom from age to age. B. They must believe implicitly in the immortality of the soul, and this implies a belief in rewards and punishments after death, in a heaven and a hell. C. They must believe in the immortality of the body and its resurrection from the grave on some day of judgment in the distant future.
I don't see these
D.
cultural connections.
But a belief in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body is not enough.
Like
for all Christian nations
they
hold
could come
to
up
these beliefs.
Separately.
They must supplement these with a determination that the body shall not perish, that the very flesh and blood in which the man died shall rise with him on the last day, and not a merely spiritual body. Now all these four things must coexist before a people proceed to embalm their dead for religious purposes. The probability that all these four things should coexist by accident in several widely separated races is slight indeed. The doctrine of chances is all against it. There is here no common necessity driving men to the same expedient, with which so many resemblances have been explained. The practice is a religious ceremony, growing out of religious beliefs, by no means common or universal, to wit, that the man who is dead shall live again, and live again in the very body in which he died. Not even all the Jews believed in these things.
Oh,
if
but he
then
says
it
Jews
should
there,
appear that among the races which we claim were descended from Atlantis, this practice of embalming the dead is found, and nowhere else, we have certainly furnished evidence which can only be explained by admitting the existence of Atlantis, and of some great religious race dwelling on Atlantis, who believed in the immortality of soul and body, and who embalmed their dead. We find, as I have shown, first, that the Guanches of the Canary Islands, supposed to be a remnant of the Atlantean population, preserved their dead as mummies. Second, that the Egyptians, the oldest colony of Atlantis, embalmed their dead in such vast multitudes that they are now exported by the ton to England, and ground up into manures to grow English turnips. Third, that the Assyrians, the Ethiopians, the Persians...
Is that real? Was he being hyperbolic? Have you guys heard about that before? No.
The Greeks, and even the Romans, embalmed their dead. Fourth, on the American continents we find that the Peruvians, the Central Americans, the Mexicans, and some of the Indian tribes follow the same practice. Is it possible to account for this singular custom?
Right.
reaching through a belt of nations and completely around the habitable world, without Atlantis? 15. All the traditions of the Mediterranean races look to the ocean as the source of men and gods. Homer sings of ocean,
Welcome,
the origin
Blue
of
Froth.
gods and Mother Tethys. Orpheus says, the fair river of ocean was the first to marry, and he espoused his sister Tethys, who was his mother's daughter. Plato's Dialogues, Cratylus, page 402. The ancients always alluded to the ocean as a river encircling the earth, as in the map of Cosmos. See page 95 and before. Probably a reminiscence of the great canal described by Plato, which surrounded the plain of Atlantis. Homer, in the Iliad, Book 18, describes Tethys, the mother goddess, coming to Achilles from the deep abysses of the main. The circling Nereids with their mistress weep, and all the sea-green sisters of the deep. Plato surrounds the great statue of Poseidon in Atlantis with the images of 100 Nereids. 16. In the deluge legends of the Hindus, as given on page 87 and before, we have seen Manu saving a small fish, which subsequently grew to a great size, and warned him of the coming of the flood. In this legend, all the indications point to an ocean as the scene of the catastrophe. It says, at the close of the last Kalpa, there was a general destruction, caused by the sleep of Brahma, whence his creatures in different worlds were drowned in a vast ocean. A holy king named Satyavrata then reigned, a servant of the spirit which moved on the waves, Poseidon, and so devout that water was his only sustenance. In 7 days the 3 worlds, remember Poseidon's trident, shall be plunged in an ocean of death. Thou shalt enter the spacious ark and continue in it secure from the flood on one immense ocean. The sea overwhelmed its shores, deluged the whole earth, augmented by showers from immense clouds. Asiatic Researches, Volume 1, page 230. All this reminds us of the fountains of the great deep and the floodgates of heaven, and seems to repeat precisely the story of Plato as to the sinking of Atlantis in the ocean. 17. While I do not attach much weight to verbal similarities in the languages of the 2 continents, nevertheless there are some that are very remarkable. We have seen the Pan and Maya of the Greeks reappearing in the Pan and Maya of the Mayas of Central America. The god of the Welsh triads, Hu the Mighty, is found in the Hunappu, the hero god of the Quiches, in Hunappu, a hero god, and in Huhunappu, in Hunkam, and Hunabats, semi-divine heroes of the Quiches. The Phoenician deity El was subdivided into a number of hypostases called the Baalim, secondary divinities, emanating from the substance of the deity. Ancient History, East, Volume 2, page 219. And this word, Baalim, we find appearing in the mythology of the Central Americans, applied to the semi-divine progenitors of the human race, Balim Kitse, Balamagab, and Ikibalam. End of recording. End of chapter 4. Recording by Mike Harris.
Who are we getting this time? I want that French woman back.
Section 20,
Oh,
Part
God.
3, Chapter 5 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Section 20, Chapter 5, The Question of Complexion. The tendency of scientific thought in ethnology is in the direction of giving more and more importance to the race characteristics.
Mike Davis is the goat,
such as
though.
height,
He's good.
color of the hair, eyes,
Mike
and
Davis, his
skin,
name?
and the formation of the skull and body generally, than to language. The language possessed by a people may be merely the result of conquest or migration. For instance, in the United States today, white, black, and red men, the descendants of French, Spanish,
Carrots, that's it.
Italians, Mexicans, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, all speak the English language, and by the test of language, they are all Englishmen, and yet none of them are connected by birth or descent with the country where that language was developed. There is a general misconception as to the color of the European and American races. Europe is supposed to be peopled exclusively by white men.
Okay.
But in reality, every
Okay. I know he's about to expand on that point, but that's all right. We're getting to the racism. There is some serious racism going on. I don't know why Dibble didn't share these quotes.
shade of color is represented on that continent, from the fair complexion of the fairest of the Swedes to the dark-skinned inhabitants of the Mediterranean coast, only a shade lighter than the Berbers or Moors on the opposite side of that sea.
He said the
Tacitus
Italians are
spoke
black.
of the, quote, black Celts, end quote. And the term, so far as complexion goes, might not inappropriately
Yes.
be applied to
The
some
Amish call Americans the English. They do. Yeah, they're also inbred, so take that with a grain of salt. Not all of them, I assume. Some of them, I assume, are fine people.
of the Italians, Spaniards, and Portuguese, while the Basques are represented as of a still darker hue. Tyler says, Anthropology, page 67, quote, on the whole, it seems that the distinction of color from the fairest Englishman to the darkest African has no hard and fast lines, but varies gradually from one tint to another, end quote. And when we turn to America, we find that the popular opinion that all Indians are, quote, red men, end quote, and of the same hue from Patagonia to Hudson's Bay, is a gross error. Pritchard says, Researches into the Physical History of Mankind, Volume 1, page 269, 4th edition, 1841, quote, it will be easy to show that the American races show nearly as great a variety in this respect as the nations of the old continent. There are among them white races with a florid complexion, and tribes black or of a very dark hue, that their stature, figure, and countenance are almost equally diversified. End quote. John T. Short says, North Americans of Antiquity, page 189, quote, the Menominees, sometimes called the White Indians, formerly occupied the region bordering on Lake Michigan around Green Bay. The whiteness of these Indians, which is
this is the
compared to
image.
that of white mulattoes,
This is the image on Wikipedia when you look up the Menonomes. What is this guy doing? Oh, I can't go in. What are you doing, man? Oh my gosh, look at that hat. Ridiculous. Okay, I'm sorry. Back to the...
early attracted the attention of the Jesuit missionaries and has often been commented on by travelers. While it is true that hybridy has done much to lighten the color of many of the tribes, still the peculiarity of the complexion of this people has been marked since the first time a European encountered them. Almost every shade, from the ash color of the Menominees through the
Yes.
cinnamon red,
It's a leprechaun.
copper, and bronze tints, may be found among the tribes formerly occupying the territory east of the Mississippi until we reach the dark-skinned
I can't put a lot of a stake in these ones because I don't think there's a lot of like historical ways to prove this. And also like when he showed me the Yamanasi, I think like if they looked darker, like yes, there in number one there is a range of skin tones in the Americas just like there is anywhere else, and I don't think that necessarily means an African or a European for whiter origin for them. It's just, you know, it's just not the same for people that developed like tens of thousands of years different skin tones, different amounts of melanin. So it's it's whatever. But the Yamanasi and a few others, like they probably just had like black Africans freed slaves or runaway slaves as parts of like their genetic stock. I mean that's true of um the Seminoles. That's like they were explicitly that. So I don't know. It's we're gonna listen to it, but there's not much. I can't do anything with this.
Laws of Kansas, who are nearly as black as the Negro. The variety of complexion
God,
is as great
the
in
way
South
they're writing
America as among the tribes of the northern part of the continent. End quote. In footnote of page 107 of volume 3 of U.S. Explorations for a Railroad Route to the Pacific Ocean, we are told, quote, many of the Indians of Zuni, New Mexico, are white. They have a fair skin, blue eyes, chestnut or auburn hair, and are quite good-looking. They claim to be full-blooded Zunians, and have no tradition of intermarriage with any foreign race. The circumstance creates no surprise among this people, for from time immemorial a similar class of people has existed
I just
among
saw
the tribe. End quote. Winchell says, quote,
Oh my
the
gosh, I
ancient
just saw
Indians
something
of
in the next one.
California in the latitude of 40 degrees were as black as the Negroes of Guinea, while in Mexico were tribes of an olive or reddish complexion, relatively light. Among the black races of tropical regions, we find generally
sure.
some light-colored tribes interspersed. These sometimes have light hair and blue eyes. This is the case with the Tuareg of the Sahara, the Afghans of India, and the Aborigines of the banks of the Orinoco and the Amazon. End quote. Winchell's Pre-Adamites, page 185. William Penn said of the Indians of Pennsylvania in his letter of August 1683, quote, the natives are generally tall, straight, well built, and of a singular proportion. They tread strong and clever, and mostly walk with a lofty chin. Their eye is little and black, not unlike a straight-looked Jew. I have seen among them as comely, European-like faces of both sexes as on your side of the sea. And truly an
What?
Italian complexion hath not much more of the white, and the noses of several of them have as much of the Roman. For their original, I am ready to believe them to be of the Jewish race. I mean of the stock of the 10 tribes, and that for the following reasons. First, in the next place, I find them to be of the like countenance, and their children of so lively a resemblance that a man would think himself in Duke's Place or Berry Street in London when he seeth them. But this is not all. They agree in rites. They reckon by moons. They offer their first fruits. They have a kind of Feast of Tabernacles.
This is the point. We can't prove what they look like at all. So what we're listening to here, this is just for fun. I can't, like, it's crazy. This is crazy. I don't know what to say.
They are said to lay their altars upon 12 stones, their mourning a year, customs of women, with many other things that do not now occur. End quote. Upon this question of complexion, Catlin, in his Indians of North America, Volume 1, page 95, etc., gives us some curious information. We have already seen that the Mandans
Did he say that they claim to be a lost tribe?
preserved an image of the Ark and possessed legends of clearly Atlantean character. Catlin says, quote, a stranger in the Mandan village is first struck with the different shades of complexion and various colors of hair, which he sees in a crowd
so this is the thing that Rastafarians, as well as which is rooted in Ethiopian culture, oddly enough, which is related to the Chumash, which is one of the great civilizations that Donnelly that Donnelly identified. But also Black Hebrew nationalists have this belief as well.
about him,
They think they're the Jews. That's what they think.
and is at once disposed to exclaim, "These are not Indians." There are a great many of these people whose complexions appear as light as half-breeds, and among the women particularly,
Oh my
there
God.
are many whose skins are almost white, with the most pleasing symmetry and proportion of feature, with hazel, with gray, and with blue.
No, yeah, I get it, Vingal. I don't think it's, I'm just enjoying it. It's just that there's nothing I can do to evaluate it because there's no proof of this. It's just how people said people looked. So it's like, and I don't know why. It's just there's nothing there to make a provable point with like a modern level of requirement of evidence.
Eyes, with mildness and sweetness of expression, and excessive modesty of demeanor, which render them exceedingly pleasing and beautiful. Why this diversity of complexion I cannot tell, nor can they themselves account for it. Their traditions, so far as I can learn them, afford us no information of their having had any knowledge of white men before the visit of Lewis and Clark, made to their village 33 years ago. Since that time until now, 1835, there have been very few visits of white men to this place, and surely not enough to have changed the complexions and customs of a nation. And I recollect perfectly well that Governor Clark told me before I started for this place that I would find the Mandans a strange people and half white. Among the females may be seen every shade and color of hair that can be seen in our own country, except red or auburn, which is not to be found. There are very many of both sexes and of every age, from infancy to manhood and old age, with hair of a very bright, silvery gray, and in some instances almost perfectly white. This unaccountable phenomenon is not the result of disease or habit, but it is unquestionably an hereditary characteristic which runs in families, and indicates no inequality in disposition or intellect, and by passing this hair through my hands, I have found it uniformly to be as coarse and harsh as a horse's mane, differing materially from the hair of other colors, which among the Mandans is generally as fine and soft as silk. The stature of the Mandans is rather below the ordinary size of man, with beautiful symmetry of form and proportion, and wonderful suppleness and elasticity." Catlin gives us a group, 54, showing this great diversity in complexion. One of the figures is painted almost pure white, and with light hair. The faces are European. Major James W. Lind, who lived among the Dakota Indians for 9 years and was killed by them in the great outbreak of 1862, says, Manuscript History of Dakotas, Library Historical Society, Minnesota, page 47, after calling attention to the fact that the different tribes of the Sioux Nation represent several different degrees of darkness of color.
Did he say that? How did I miss that? How did I miss that? I must have been spacing out. I'll find it.
Quote, "The Dakota child is of lighter complexion than the young brave, this one lighter than the middle-aged man, and the middle-aged man lighter than the superannuated homo, who, by smoke, paint, dirt, and a drying up of the vital juices, appears to be the true copper-colored Dakota. The color of the Dakotas varies with the nation, and also with the age and condition of the individual. It may be set down, however, as a shade lighter than olive, yet it becomes still lighter by change of condition or mode of life, and nearly vanishes, even in the child, under constant ablutions and avoiding of exposure. Those children in the mission at Hazelwood, who are taken very young and not allowed to expose themselves, lose almost entirely the olive shade, and become quite as white as the American child. The Mandans are as light as the peasants of Spain, while their brothers, the Crows, are as dark as the Arabs. Dr. Goodrich, in The Universal Traveler, page 154, says that the modern Peruvians in the warmer regions of Peru are as fair as the people of the south of Europe. End quote. The Aymaras, the ancient inhabitants of the mountains of Peru and Bolivia, are described as having an olive-brown complexion, with regular features, large heads, and a thoughtful and melancholy cast of countenance. They practiced in early times the deformation of the skull. Professor Wilson describes the hair of the ancient Peruvians, as found upon their mummies, as, quote, a lightish brown, and of a fineness of texture which equals that of the Anglo-Saxon race. End quote. Quote, the ancient Peruvians, says Short, North Americans of Antiquity, page 187, quote, appear, from numerous examples of hair found in their tombs, to have been an auburn-haired race. End quote. Garcilaso, who had an opportunity of seeing the body of the king Viracocha, describes the hair of that monarch as snow white. Haywood tells us of the discovery, at the beginning of this century, of 3 mummies in a cave on the south side of the Cumberland River, Tennessee, who were buried in baskets, as the Peruvians were originally buried, and whose skin was fair and white, and their hair auburn, and of a fine texture. Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee, page 191. Neither is the common opinion correct, which asserts all the American Indians to be of the same type of features. The portraits on this page, and on pages 187 and 191, taken from the report of the U.S. Survey for a route for a Pacific Railroad, present features very much like those of Europeans. In fact, every face here could be precisely matched among the inhabitants of the southern part of the old continent. On the other hand, look at the portrait of the great Indian orator and reformer Savonarola on page 193.
Just because they look similar doesn't mean they come from a common origin. Like the epileptic, that's not what it is. But the fold that Asians have on their eyelids, and like Norse people have that too, and Khoisan people have that. Like a bunch of different people have that. And I think genetically they were seen to have been developed separately. Like the Aboriginal Australians are not related. Epicanthic, thank you. Epicanthic fold, like it's a thing that they can develop separately. So can dark skin. This was just a very old, biblical almost way of thinking about things.
Looks more like the hunting Indians of northwestern America than any of the preceding faces. In fact, if it was dressed with a scalp lock, it would pass muster anywhere as a portrait of the, quote, man afraid of his horses, end quote, or, quote, sitting bull, end quote. Adam was, it appears, a red man. Winchell tells us that Adam is derived from the red earth. The radical letters Adam are found in Adama, quote, something out of which vegetation was made to germinate, end quote, to wit, the earth. Odom and Odom signify red, ruddy, bay-colored, as of a horse, the color of a red heifer. Quote, Adam,
a red heifer,
a man,
that's important
a
for
human
prophecies.
being, male or female,
What's up,
red,
Bob? How you doing?
ruddy, end quote. Pre-Adamites, page 161. Quote, the Arabs distinguished mankind into 2 races, one red, ruddy, the other black, end quote. Ibid. They classed themselves among the red men. Not only was Adam a red man, but there is evidence that, from the highest antiquity, red was a sacred color. The gods of the ancients were always painted red. The Wisdom of Solomon refers to this custom. Quote, the carpenter carved it elegantly, and formed it by the skill of his understanding, and fashioned it to the shape of a man, or made it like some vile beast, laying it over with vermilion and with paint, coloring it red, and covering every spot
Red
therein."
ochre.
End quote. The idols of the Indians were also painted red, and red was the religious color. Lynn's manuscript History of Dakotas, Library, Historical Society, Minnesota. The Cushites and Ethiopians, early branches of the Atlantean stock, took their name from their, quote, sunburnt, end quote, complexion. They were red men. The name of the Phoenicians signified red. Himyar, the prefix of the Himyaritic Arabians, also means red, and the Arabs were painted red on the Egyptian monuments. The ancient Egyptians were red men. They recognized 4 races of men: the red, yellow, black, and white men.
The red, yellow, black, and white is coming up again. Like, just like that thing, the medicine wheel, the Native American medicine wheel. That's so weird.
They themselves belonged to the Rot, or red men. The yellow men they called Namu. It included the Asiatic races. The black men were called Nahsu, and the white men Tamhu. The following figures are copied from Knott and Gliddon's Types of Mankind, page 85, and were taken by them from the great works of Belzoni, Champollion, and Lepsius. In later ages, so desirous were the Egyptians of preserving the aristocratic distinction of the color of their skin that they represented themselves on the monuments as of a crimson hue, an exaggeration of their original race complexion. In the same way, we find that the ancient Aryan writings divided mankind into 4 races: the white, red, yellow, and black. The 4 castes of India were founded upon these distinctions in color. In fact, the word for color in Sanskrit, varna, means caste. The red men, according to the Mahabharata, were the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, who were afterward engaged in
I don't know why it's okay to say black and white, but it's not okay to say red and yellow. Like, it's not like black and white are really that accurate either. The red, yellow, I saw a quote from Xi Jinping where he described Chinese people as the yellow race, the people of the dragon, that was weird. I don't know. Like, why is it okay there and then it became not okay here? Whatever, doesn't matter.
Fierce contest with the whites, the Brahmins, and were nearly exterminated, although some of them survived, and from their stock Buddha was born. So that not only the Mohammedan and Christian,
Chinese,
but the
not
Buddhistic
Chinese
religion
Americans.
seems to be derived from the branches of the Hamitic or red stock. The great Manu was also of the red race. The Egyptians, while they painted themselves red-brown, represented the nations of Palestine as yellow-brown, and the Libyans as yellow-white. The present inhabitants of Egypt range from a yellow color in the north parts to a deep bronze. Tyler is of opinion, Anthropology, page 95, that the ancient Egyptians belonged to a brown race, which embraced the Nubian tribes and, to some extent, the Berbers of Algiers and Tunis. He groups the Assyrians, Phoenicians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Andalusians, Bretons, dark Welshmen, and people of the Caucasus into one body, and designates them as, quote, dark whites, end quote. The Himyarite Arabs, as I have shown, derived their name originally from their red color, and they were constantly depicted on the Egyptian monuments as red or light brown. Herodotus tells us that there was a nation of Libyans called the Maxians, who claimed descent from the people of Troy. The walls of Troy, we shall see, were built by Poseidon, that is to say, Troy was an Atlantean colony. These Maxians painted their whole bodies red. The Zavesians, the ancestors of the Zouaves of Algiers, the tribe that gave their name to the French Zouaves, also painted themselves red. Some of the Ethiopians were, quote, copper-colored, end quote. American Encyclopedia, article Egypt, page 464. Tyler says, Anthropology, page 160, quote, the language of the ancient Egyptians, though it cannot be classed in the Semitic family with Hebrew, has some important points of correspondence, whether due to the long intercourse between the two races in Egypt, or to some deeper ancestral connection, and such analogies also appear in the Berber languages of North Africa, end quote. These last were called by the ancients the Atlanteans. Quote, if a congregation of 12 representatives from Malacca, China, Japan, Mongolia, Sandwich Islands, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Chickasaws, Comanches, etc., were dressed alike, or undressed and unshaven, the most skillful anatomist could not, from their appearance, separate them. End quote. Fontaine's How the World Was Peopled, pages 147 to 44. Ferdinand Columbus, in his relation of his father's voyages, compares the inhabitants of Guanani to the Canary Islanders, an Atlantean race, and describes the inhabitants of San Domingo as still more beautiful and fair. In Peru, the Charanzanis, studied by Monsieur Ancrode, also resemble the Canary Islanders. L'Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg imagined himself surrounded by Arabs when all his...
Hey, like the video, please. Please do that. I appreciate it. Also, Patreon's $2 a month down below. It's early and unedited episodes.
Indians of Rabinal were around him, for they had, he said, their complexion, features, and beard. Pierre Martyr speaks of the Indians of the Parian Gulf as having fair hair. The Human Species, page 201. The same author believes that tribes belonging to the Semitic type are also found in America. He refers to, quote, certain traditions of Guyana and the use in the country of a weapon entirely characteristic of the ancient Canary Islanders, end quote. When science is able to disabuse itself of the Mortonian theory that the aborigines of America are all red men and all belong to one race, we may hope that the confluence upon the continent of widely different races from different countries may come to be recognized and intelligently studied. There can be no doubt that red, white, black, and yellow men have united to form the original population of America, and there can be as little doubt that the entire population of Europe and the south shore of the Mediterranean is a mongrel race, a combination in varying proportions of a dark brown or red race with a white race, the characteristics of the different nations depending upon the proportions in which the dark and light races are mingled, for peculiar mental and moral characteristics go with these complexions.
Wow.
The red-haired people are a distinct variety of the white stock. There were once whole tribes and nations with this color of hair. Their blood is now intermingled with all the races of men, from Palestine to Iceland. Everything in Europe speaks of vast periods of time, and long, continued, and constant interfusion of bloods, until there is not a fair-skinned man on the continent that has not the blood of the dark-haired race in his veins, nor scarcely a dark-skinned man that is not lighter in hue from intermixture with the white stock. End of part 3, chapter 5.
Okay.
End of section 20.
He was being pretty neutral there, actually. Oh, here we go. We're on to That's the end of part 1 of 3. Part 2.
Section
Another
21.
7 hours.
Part 3, Chapter 6 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Section 21. Chapter 6. Genesis contains a history of Atlantis. The Hebrews are a branch of the great family of which that powerful commercial race, the Phoenicians, who were the merchants of the world 1,500 years before the time of Christ, were a part. The Hebrews carried out from the common storehouse of their race a mass of traditions, many of which have come down to us in that oldest and most venerable of human compositions, the Book of Genesis. I have shown that the story of the deluge plainly refers to the destruction of Atlantis, and that it agrees in many important particulars with the account given by Plato. The people destroyed were, in both instances, the ancient race that had created civilization. They had formerly been in a happy and sinless condition. They had become great and wicked. They were destroyed for their sins. They were destroyed by water. But we can go farther, and it can be asserted that there is scarcely a prominent fact in the opening chapters of the Book of Genesis that cannot be duplicated from the legends of the American nations, and scarcely a custom known to the Jews that does not find its counterpart among the people of the New World. Even in the history of the creation, we find these similarities. The Bible tells us, Genesis 1:2, that in the beginning the earth was without form and void, and covered with water. In the Quiche legends we are told, quote, "At first all was sea, no man, animal, bird, or green herb. There was nothing to be seen but the sea and the heavens." End quote. The Bible says, Genesis 1:2, quote, "And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." End quote. The Quiche legend says, quote, "The Creator, the Former, the Dominator, the feathered serpent, those that give life, moved upon the waters like a glowing light." End quote. The Bible says, Genesis 1:9, quote, "And God said, Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so." End quote. The Quiche legend says, quote, "The creative spirits cried out, 'Earth!' and in an instant it was formed, and rose like a vapor cloud, and immediately the plains and the mountains arose, and the cypress and pine appeared." End quote. The Bible tells us, quote, "And God said that it was good." End quote. The Quiche legend says, quote, "Then Cucumatz was filled with joy, and cried out, 'Blessed be thy coming, O heart of heaven, Huracan, thunderbolts.'" End quote. The order in which the vegetables, animals, and man were formed is the same in both records. In Genesis chapter 2:7 we are told, quote, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground." End quote. The Quiche legend says, quote, "The first man was made of clay, but he had no intelligence, and was consumed in the water." End quote. In Genesis, the first man is represented as naked. The Aztec legend says,
Okay, well,
quote,
that just
"The
seems
sun was much nearer the
what you
earth
would
then
naturally
than
do.
now, and his grateful warmth rendered clothing unnecessary." End quote. Even the temptation
Better
of
way to say it, I
Eve
think.
reappears in the American legends. Lord Kingsborough says,
Yeah, but
quote,
temptation, like a lot of these things are just like common stories that you just see across human cultures. I don't know. Like it's possible that they're connected literally, but it's also possible they're just things that humans talk about because of shared humanity and we don't know why. We want something harder, which is this is the difference between like this book and the stuff that Graham Hancock talks about. Because yeah, there's similarities with what Graham talks about, but it's not the same or anywhere close to the same.
the Toltecs had paintings of a garden, with a single tree standing in the midst. Round the root of the tree is entwined a serpent, whose head appearing above the foliage displays the face of a woman. Torquemada admits the existence of this tradition among them, and agrees with the Indian historians who affirm that this was the first woman in the world, who bore children,
actually don't know
and
who
from
that is.
whom all
I
mankind
assume he's
are
very cool, though.
descended. End quote. Mexican Antiquities, Volume 8, page 19. There is also a legend of Suchiquecal, who disobediently gathered roses from a tree, and thereby disgraced and injured herself and all her posterity. Mexican Antiquities, Volume 6, page 401. The legends of the Old World, which underlie Genesis and were used by Milton in the Paradise Lost, appear in the Mexican legends of a war of angels
read
in
that.
heaven and the fall of Zutemke, Sutem, Satan, Arabic Shatana, and the other rebellious spirits. We have seen that the Central Americans possessed striking parallels to the accounts of the deluge in Genesis. There is also clearly established legend which singularly resembles the Bible record of the Tower of Babel. Father Duran, in his manuscript Historia Antica de la Nueva España, A.D. 1585, quotes from the lips of a native of Cholula, over 100 years old, a version of the legend as to the building of the Great Pyramid of Cholula. It is as follows. Quote, "In the beginning, before the light of the world had been created, this land, Cholula, was in obscurity and darkness, and void of any created thing.
I'm just thinking of the
All
hot
was
sauce.
a plain, without hill or elevation, encircled in every part by water, without tree or created thing. And immediately after the light and the sun arose in the east, there appeared gigantic men of deformed stature and possessed the land, and desiring to see the nativity of the sun as well as his occident, proposed to go and seek them. Dividing themselves into two parties, some journeyed to the west, and others toward the east. These travelled until the sea cut off their road, whereupon they determined to return to the place from which they started, and arriving at this place, Cholula, not finding the means
Cholula.
of reaching the sun,
Hot sauce.
enamored of his light and beauty, they determined to build a tower so high that its summit should reach the sky. Having collected materials for
that's
the
pretty
purpose,
close.
they
That's
found a
something.
very
I mean,
adhesive
I don't know if it's
clay
something, but
and
it sounds
bitumen,
more-
with which they speedily commenced to build the tower, and having reared it to the greatest possible altitude, so that they say it reached to the sky, the Lord of the heavens,
It's the Nephilim.
enraged,
the
said to
Nephilim.
the inhabitants of the sky, quote, "Have you observed how they of the earth have built a high and haughty tower to mount hither, being enamored of the light of the sun and his beauty? Come and confound them, because it is not right that they of the earth, living in the flesh, should mingle with us." End quote. Immediately the inhabitants of the sky sallied forth like flashes of lightning. They destroyed the edifice, and divided and scattered its builders to all parts of the earth." End quote. One can recognize in this legend the recollection by a ruder race of a highly civilized people, for only a highly civilized people would have attempted such a vast work. Their mental superiority and command of the arts gave them the character of giants who arrived from the east, who had divided into two great emigrations, one moving eastward toward Europe, the other westward toward America. They were sun worshippers, for we are told, quote, "they were enamored of the light and beauty of the sun," end quote, and they built a high place for his worship. The Pyramid of Cholula is one of the greatest constructions ever erected by human hands. It is, even now, in its ruined condition, 160 feet high, 1,400 feet square at the base, and covers 45 acres. We have only to remember that the greatest pyramid of Egypt...
I thought it was mostly just nutrition. Traces of older races. I've heard about this activatable traits thing. I haven't looked into it that much, and also it's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but that's interesting. You want to elaborate on that? Do you know about this type of thing?
Cheops covers but 12 or 13 acres to form some conception of the magnitude of this American structure. It must not be forgotten that this legend was taken down by a Catholic priest shortly after the conquest of Mexico from the lips of an old Indian who was born before Columbus sailed from Spain. Observe the resemblances between this legend and the Bible account of the building of...
You know, especially when it's even stated like that, you have to worry about if the story has been like changed, basically, by the translation, either purposefully or accidentally. It's totally possible it could have happened accidentally.
Of the Tower of Babel. All was plain, without hill or elevation, says the Indian legend. They found a plain in the valley of Shinar, and they dwelt there, says the Bible. They built of brick in both cases. Let us build us a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, says the Bible. They determined to build a tower so high that its summit should reach the sky, says the Indian legend. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had builded. And the Lord said, Behold, nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down and confound them, says the Bible record. The Lord of the heavens, enraged, said to the inhabitants of the sky, Have you observed, etc.? Come and confound them, says the Indian record. And the Lord scattered them abroad from thence on all the face of the earth, says the Bible.
No,
they scattered its builders to all parts of the earth, says the Mexican legend. Can anyone doubt that these two legends must have sprung in some way from one another, or from some common source? There are enough points of difference to show that the American is not a servile copy of the Hebrew legend. In the former, the story comes from a native of Cholula. It is told under the shadow of the mighty pyramid it commemorates. It is a local legend which he repeats. The men who built it, according to his account, were foreigners. They built it to reach the sun. That is to say, a sun temple, while in the Bible record, Babel was built to perpetuate the glory of its architects. In the Indian legend, the gods stopped the work by a great storm. In the Bible account, by confounding the speech of the people. Both legends were probably derived from Atlantis, and referred to some gigantic structure of great height, built by that people, And when the story emigrated to the east and west, it was in the one case affixed to the Tower of the Chaldeans, and in the other to the Pyramid of Cholula, precisely as we find the Ark of the Deluge resting upon separate mountain chains all the way from Greece to Armenia. In one form of the Tower of Babel legend, that of the Toltecs, we are told that the Pyramid of Cholula was erected as a means of escape from a second flood, should another occur. But the resemblances between Genesis and the American legends do not stop here. We are told, Genesis 2:21, that, quote, "The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam," end quote, and while he slept, God made Eve out of one of his ribs. According to the Quiche tradition, there were 4 men from whom the races of the world descended, probably a recollection of the red, black, yellow, and white races, and these men were without wives, and the Creator made wives for them, quote, "while they slept," end quote. Some wicked misanthrope referred to these traditions when he said, quote, "and man's first sleep became his last repose," end quote. In Genesis chapter 3:22, quote, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil." And
No, he doesn't. Tell me he didn't actually say that, and you're just joking around here.
"And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever," end quote. Therefore, God drove him out of the garden. In the Quiche legends we are told, quote, "The gods feared that they had made men too perfect, and they breathed a cloud of mist over their vision," end quote. When the ancestors of the Quiches migrated to America, the divinity parted the sea for their passage, as the Red Sea was parted for the Israelites. The story of Samson is paralleled in the history of a hero named Zipanka, told of in the Popol Vuh, who, being captured by his enemies and placed in a pit, pulled down the building in which his captors had assembled, and killed 400 of them. "There were giants in those days," says the Bible. A great deal of the Central American history is taken up with the doings of an ancient race of giants called Quinames. This parallelism runs through 100 particulars. Both the Jews and Mexicans worshipped toward the east. Both called the South, quote, "the right hand of the world," end quote. Both burnt incense toward the 4 corners of the earth. Confession of sin and sacrifice of atonement were common to both peoples. Both were punctilious about washings and ablutions. Both believed in devils, and both were afflicted with leprosy. Both considered women who died in childbirth as worthy of honor as soldiers who fell in battle.
Okay, but that's
both punished adultery with stoning to death. As David leaped and danced before the ark of the Lord, so did the Mexican monarchs before their idols. Both had an ark, the abiding place of an invisible god. Both had a species of serpent worship. Compare our representation of the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, with the following description of a Great Serpent Mound in Scotland. Quote, "Serpent worship in the West. Some additional light appears to have been thrown upon ancient serpent worship in the West by the recent archaeological explorations of Mr. John S. Feney, FGS, FRGS, in Scotland. Mr. Feney has just investigated a curious earthen mound in Glenfeechan, Argyllshire, referred to by him at the late meeting of the British Association in Edinburgh as being in the form of a serpent or saurian. The mound, says the Scotsman, is a most perfect one. The head is a large cairn, and the body of the earthen reptile 300 feet long, and in the center of the head there were evidences, when Mr. Phené first visited it, of an altar having been placed there. The position with regard to Ben Cruachan is most remarkable. The three peaks are seen over the length of the reptile, while a person is standing on the head or cairn. The shape can only be seen so as to be understood when looked down upon from an elevation, as the outline cannot be understood unless the whole of it can be seen. This is most perfect when the spectator is on the head of the animal form, or on the lofty rock to the west of it. The mound corresponds almost entirely with one 700 feet long in America, an account of which was lately published, after careful study, by Mr. Squire. The altar toward the head in each case agrees. In the American mound, 3 rivers, also objects of worship with the ancients, were evidently identified. The number 3 was a sacred number in all ancient mythologies. The sinuous winding and articulations of the vertebral spinal arrangement are anatomically perfect in the Argyllshire mound. The gentlemen present with Mr. Phené during his investigation state that beneath the cairn, forming the head of the animal, was found a megalithic chamber, in which was a quantity of charcoal and burnt earth and charred nutshells,
3 windows?
a flint
What do you mean 3
instrument,
windows?
beautifully and minutely serrated at the edge, and burnt bones. The back or spine of the serpent, which, as already stated, is 300 feet long, was found beneath the peat moss to be formed by a careful adjustment of stones, the formation of which probably prevented the structure from being obliterated by time and weather. Pall Mall Gazette. We find a striking likeness between the works of the Stone Age in America and Europe, as shown in the figures here given. The same singular custom which is found among the Jews and the Hindus, for a man to raise up seed for his deceased brother by marrying his widow, was found among the Central American nations. Las Casas, manuscript, Hist. Apoloc, chapter 213, 215, Torquemada, Monarch Ind, volume 2, 377-8. No one but the Jewish high priest might enter the Holy of Holies. A similar custom obtained in Peru. Both ate the flesh of the sacrifices of atonement. Both poured the blood of the sacrifice on the earth. They sprinkled it. They marked persons with it. They smeared it upon the walls and stones. The Mexican temple, like the Jewish, faced the east. As among the Jews, the ark was a sort of portable temple in which the deity was supposed to be continually present, so among the Mexicans, the Cherokees, and the Indians of Michoacan and Honduras, an ark was held in the highest veneration and was considered an object too sacred to be touched by any but the priest.
Yes, that's universal. Like, a lot of this stuff is just, whatever.
Kingsborough, Mex Antique, Volume 8, page 258. The Peruvians believed that the rainbow was a sign that the earth would not again be destroyed by a deluge. Ibid, page 25. The Jewish custom of laying the sins of the people upon the head of an animal and turning him out into the wilderness had its counterpart among the Mexicans, who, to cure a fever, formed a dog of maize paste and left it by the roadside, saying the first passer-by would carry away the illness. Dorman, Prim. Super, page 59. Jacob's ladder had its duplicate in the vine or tree of the Ojibways, which led from the earth to heaven, up and down which the spirits passed. Ibid, page 67. Both Jews and Mexicans offered water to a stranger that he might wash his feet. Both ate dust in token of humility, both anointed with oil, both sacrificed prisoners, both periodically separated the women, and both agreed in the strong and universal idea of uncleanness, connected with that period. Both believed in the occult power of water, and both practiced baptism. Quote, "Then the Mexican midwife gave the child to taste of the water, putting her moistened fingers in its mouth, and said, 'Take this. By this thou hast to live on the earth, to grow and to flourish. Through this we get all things that support existence on the earth. Receive it.' Then with moistened fingers she touched the breast of the child and said, 'Behold, the pure water that washes and cleanses thy heart, and removes all filthiness. Receive it. May the goddess see good to purify and cleanse thine heart.' Then the midwife poured water upon the head of the child, saying, 'O my grandson, my son, take this water of the Lord of the world, which is thy life, invigorating and refreshing, washing and cleansing. I pray that this celestial water, blue and light blue, may enter into thy body, and there live. I pray that it may destroy in thee and put away from thee all the things evil and adverse that were given thee before the beginning of the world. Wheresoever thou art in this child, O thou hurtful thing, be gone, leave it, put thyself apart, for now does it live anew, and anew is it born. Now again is it purified and cleansed, now again is it shaped and engendered by our mother, the goddess of water.'" End quote. Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 3, page 372. Here we find many resemblances to the Christian ordinance of baptism, the pouring of the water on the head, the putting of the fingers in the mouth, the touching of the breast, the new birth, and the washing away of the original sin. The Christian rite, we know, was not a Christian invention, but was borrowed from ancient times, from the great storehouse of Asiatic traditions and beliefs. The Mexicans hung up the heads of their sacrificed enemies. This was also a Jewish custom. Quote, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, and the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor." End quote. Numbers 25:4-5. The Scythians, Herodotus tells us, scalped their enemies, and carried the scalp at the pommel of their saddles. The Jews probably scalped their enemies. Quote, "But God shall wound the head of his enemies, and the hairy scalp of such a one as goeth on still in his trespasses." End quote. Psalm 68:21. The ancient Scandinavians practiced scalping. When Harold Harefoot seized his rival, Alfred, with 600 followers, he, quote, "had them maimed, blinded, hamstrung, scalped, and emboweled." End quote. Taine's History of English Literature, page 35. Herodotus describes the Scythian mode of taking the scalp. Quote, "He makes a cut round the head near the ears, and shakes the skull out." End quote. Scalps a man, end quote, as one of the characteristics.
I gotta skip this part because of YouTube's algorithm.
Lock in the middle. The Manchus of Tartary wear a scalp lock, as do the modern Chinese.
The
Byron
link,
describes the
if you want to, the link to the PDF is, that's the old PDF. I gotta put the new one on there.
Heads of the dead Tartars under the walls of Corinth, devoured by the wild dogs. Quote, "Crimson and green were the shawls of their wear, and each scalp had a single long tuft of hair. All the rest were shaven and bare." End quote. These resemblances are so striking and so numerous that repeated attempts have been made to prove that the inhabitants of America are the descendants of the Jews. Some have claimed that they represented, quote, "the lost tribes,"
don't some Mormons
quote,
believe
of
something
that
like
people.
this?
But as the Jews were never a maritime or emigrating people, they formed no colonies. And it is impossible to believe as has been asserted, that they left their flocks and herds, marched across the whole face of Asia, took ships, and sailed across the greatest of the oceans to a continent of the existence of which they had no knowledge. If we seek the origin of these extraordinary coincidences in opinions and habits, we must go far back of the time of the lost tribes.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with James
we
Cameron,
must seek
man. Makes good movies,
in the relationship of the Jews to the family of Noah, and in the identity of the Noachic race destroyed by the deluge with the people of the drowned Atlantis. Nor need it surprise us to find traditions perpetuated for thousands upon thousands of years, especially among a people having a religious priesthood. The essence of religion is conservatism. Little is invented. Nothing perishes. Change comes from without. And even when one religion is supplanted by another, its gods live on as the demons of the new faith, or they pass into the folklore and fairy stories of the people. We see Wotan, a hero in America, become the god Odin or Woden in Scandinavia. And when his worship as a god dies out, Odin survives, as Dr. Dasent has proved in The Wild Huntsman of the Hearts, and in the Robin Hood, Udin, of popular legend. The Hellequin of France becomes the Harlequin of our pantomimes. William Tell never existed. He is a myth, a survival of the sun god Apollo, Indra, who was worshipped on the altars of Atlantis. Quote, "Nothing here, but it doth change into something rich and strange."
Could have been.
End quote. The rite of circumcision dates back to the first days of Phoenicia, Egypt, and the Cushites. It too was probably an Atlantean custom, invented in the Stone Age. Tens of thousands of years have passed since the Stone Age. The ages of copper, bronze, and iron have intervened, and yet to this day the Hebrew rabbi performs the ceremony of circumcision with a stone knife. Frothingham says, speaking of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, "Into what depths of antiquity the ceremonies carried me back! To the mysteries of Eleusis, to the sacrificial rites of Phoenicia. The boys swung the censers as censers had been swung in the adoration of Bacchus. The girdle and cassock of the priests came from Persia. The veil and tonsure were from Egypt. The alb and chasuble were prescribed by Numa Pompilius. The stole was borrowed from the official who used it to throw it on the back of the victim that was to be sacrificed. The white surplice was the same as described by Juvenal and Ovid."
Yeah, I don't know who the narrator is on this one.
Although it is
Vaguely
evident
British.
that many thousands of years must have passed since the men who wrote in Sanskrit in northwestern India could have dwelt in Europe, yet to this day they preserve among their ancient books maps and descriptions of the western coast of Europe, and even of England and Ireland, and we find among them a fuller knowledge of the vexed question of the sources of the Nile than was possessed by any nation in the world 25 years ago. This perpetuation of forms and beliefs is illustrated in the fact that the formulas used in the Middle Ages in Europe to exorcise evil spirits were Assyrian words, imported probably thousands of years before from the magicians of Chaldea. When the European conjurer cried out to the demon, quote, "Hilka, Hilka, Besha, Besha," end quote, he had no idea that he was repeating the very...
I remember that special, man. Those specials were my favorite. I kept watching the American version ones too, but separate
words of a people who had perished ages before, and that they signified, go away, evil one, evil one." Lenormant, Ancient History of the East, Volume 1, page 448. Our circle of 360 degrees, the division of a chord of the circle equal to the radius into 60 equal parts called degrees, the division of these into 60 minutes, of the minute into 60 seconds, and the second into 60 thirds, the division of the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds, the division of the week into 7 days, and the very order of the days, all have come down to us from the Chaldeo-Assyrians, and these things will probably be perpetuated among our posterity, "to the last syllable of recorded time." We need not be surprised, therefore, to find the same legends and beliefs cropping out among the nations of Central America and the people of Israel. Nay, it should teach us to regard the book of Genesis with increased veneration as a relic dating from the most ancient days of man's history on earth. Its roots cross the great ocean. Every line is valuable. A word, a letter, an accent may throw light upon the gravest problems of the birth of civilization. The vital conviction which, during thousands of years, at all times pressed home upon the Israelites, was that they were a "chosen people," selected out of all the multitude of the earth, to perpetuate the great truth that there was but one God, an illimitable, omnipotent, paternal spirit, who rewarded the good and punished the wicked, in contradistinction from the multifarious, subordinate, animal, and bestial demigods of the other nations of the earth. This sublime monotheism could only have been the outgrowth of a high civilization, for man's first religion is necessarily a worship of "stocks and stones," and history teaches us that the gods decrease in number as man increases in intelligence. It was probably in Atlantis that monotheism was first preached. The Proverbs of Ptahhotep, the oldest book of the Egyptians, show that this most ancient colony from Atlantis received the pure faith from the motherland at the very dawn of history. This book preached the doctrine of one God, "the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked." Reginald S. Poole, Contemporary Review, August 1881, page 38. "In the early days, the Egyptians worshipped one only God, the maker of all things, without beginning and without end. To the last the priests preserved this doctrine and taught it privately to a select few." American Encyclopedia, Volume 6, page 463. The Jews took up this great truth where the Egyptians dropped it, and over the beads and over the ruins of Egypt, Chaldea, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, and India, this handful of poor shepherds, ignorant, debased, and despised, have carried down to our own times a conception which could only have originated in the highest possible state of human society. And even skepticism must pause before the miracle of the continued existence of this strange people, wading through the ages, bearing on their shoulders the burden of their great trust, and pressing forward under the force of a perpetual and irresistible impulse. The speech that may be heard today in the synagogues of Chicago and Melbourne resounded 2,000 years ago in the streets of Rome, and at a still earlier period it could be heard in the palaces of Babylon and in the shops of Thebes, in Tyre, in Sidon, in Gades, in Palmyra, in Nineveh. How many nations have perished? How many languages have ceased to exist? How many splendid civilizations have crumbled into ruin? How many temples and towers and towns have gone down to dust since the sublime frenzy of monotheism first seized this extraordinary people? All their kindred nomadic tribes are gone. Their land of promise is in the hands of strangers, but Judaism, with its offspring Christianity, is taking possession of the habitable world, and the continuous life of one people, one poor, obscure, and wretched people, spans the tremendous gulf between Ptahhotep and this 19th century. If the spirit of which the universe is but an expression, of whose frame the stars are the infinite molecules, can be supposed ever to interfere with the laws of matter and reach down into the doings of men, would it not be to save from the wreck and waste of time the most sublime fruit of the civilization of the drowned Atlantis? A belief in the one,
writing.
only, just God, the Father of all life,
I don't think
the
I have
imposer of all moral obligations. End of Part 3, Chapter 6. End of Section 21.
New reader?
Section 22. Part 3, Chapter 7
Uh-oh.
of Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox
I don't
recording.
know how I feel
All
about it.
LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 7. The Origin of Our Alphabet. One of the most marvelous inventions for the advancement of mankind is the phonetic alphabet, or a system of signs representing the sounds of human speech. Without it, our present civilization could scarcely have been possible. No solution of the origin of our European alphabet has yet been obtained. We can trace it back from nation to nation and form to form until we reach the Egyptians, and the archaic forms of the Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Cushites, but beyond this the light fails us. The Egyptians spoke of their hieroglyphic system of writing not as their own invention, but as the language of the gods. Lenormant and Cheval, Ancient History of the East, Volume 2, page 208. The gods were doubtless their highly civilized ancestors, the people of Atlantis, who, as we shall hereafter see, became the gods of many of the Mediterranean races. According to the Phoenicians, the art of writing was invented by Tautus, or Taut, whom the Egyptians called Thauth, and the Egyptians said it was invented by Thauth or Thoth, otherwise called the first Hermes, in which we clearly see that both the Phoenicians and Egyptians referred the invention to a period older than their own separate political existence, and to an older nation, from which both peoples received it. Baldwin's Prehistoric Nations, page 91. The first Hermes here referred to, afterward called Mercury by the Romans, was a son of Zeus and Maia, a daughter of Atlas. This is the same Maia whom the Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg identifies with the Maya of Central America. Sir William Drummond, in his Origins, said, "There seems to be no way of accounting either for the early use of letters among so many different nations, or for the resemblance which existed between some of the graphic systems employed by those nations, than by supposing hieroglyphical writing, if I may be allowed the term, to have been in use among the Sabaists in the first ages after the flood, when Sabaism, planet worship, was the religion of almost every country that was yet inhabited." Sir Henry Rawlinson says, "So great is the analogy between the first principles of the science of writing, as it appears to have been pursued in Chaldea, and as we can actually trace its progress in Egypt, that we can hardly hesitate to assign the original invention to a period before the Hamitic race had broken up and divided. It is not to be believed that such an extraordinary system of sound signs could have been the invention of any one man, or even of any one age. Like all our other acquisitions, it must have been the slow growth and accretion of ages. It must have risen step by step from picture writing, through an intermediate condition like that of the Chinese, where each word or thing was
Intermediate
represented by a
condition
separate
like that of
sign.
the Chinese. I
The
love
fact that
that.
so old and enlightened a people as the
I mean,
Chinese have never
I
reached a
love
phonetic
that
alphabet
they said
gives
that.
us some indication of the greatness of the people among whom it was invented, and the lapse of time before they attained to it. Humboldt says, "According to the views which, since Champollion's great discovery, have been gradually adopted regarding the earlier condition of the development of alphabetical writing, the Phoenician as well as the Semitic characters are to be regarded as a phonetic alphabet that has originated from pictorial writing, as one in which the ideal signification of the symbols is wholly disregarded, and the characters are regarded as mere signs for sounds." Cosmos, Vol. 2, page 129. Baldwin says, Prehistoric Nations, page 93, "The nation that becomes mistress of the seas, established communication with every shore, and monopolized the commerce of the known world, must have substituted a phonetic alphabet for the hieroglyphics as it gradually grew to this eminence, while isolated Egypt, less affected by the practical wants and tendencies of commercial enterprise, retained the hieroglyphic system, and carried it to a marvelous height of perfection." It must be remembered that some of the letters of our alphabet are inventions of the later nations. In the oldest alphabets there was no C, the G taking its place. The Romans converted the G into a C, and then, finding the necessity for a G sign, made one by adding a tail piece to the C. The Greeks added to the ancient alphabet the upsilon, shaped like our V or Y,
Upsilon.
the two forms being used at first indifferently. They added the X sign. They converted the T of the Phoenicians into th or theta, Z and S into signs for double consonants. They turned the Phoenician Y, yod, into I, iota. The Greeks converted the Phoenician alphabet, which was partly consonantal, into one purely phonetic, a perfect instrument for the expression of spoken language. The W was also added to the Phoenician alphabet. The Romans added the Y. At first, I and J were both indicated by the same sound. A sign for J was afterward added. We have also, in common with other European languages, added a W, that is, VV, or W, to represent the W sound. The letters, then, which we owe to the Phoenicians are A, B, C, D, E, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, Z. If we are to trace out resemblances with the alphabet of any other country, it must be with these signs. Is there any other country to which we can turn which possessed a phonetic alphabet in any respect kindred to this Phoenician alphabet? It cannot be the Chinese alphabet, which has more signs than words. It cannot be the cuneiform alphabet of Assyria, with its 700 arrow-shaped characters, none of which bear the slightest affinity to the Phoenician letters. It is a surprising fact that we find in Central America a phonetic alphabet. This is in the alphabet of the Mayas, the ancient people of the peninsula of Yucatan, who claim that their civilization came to them across the sea in ships from the east, that is,
So just
from the
the
direction of
existence
Atlantis.
a phonetic alphabet is
The
gonna be
Mayas
evidence of
succeeded
this?
to the Colhuas, whose era terminated 1,000 years before the time of Christ. From them they received their alphabet. It has come to us through Bishop Landa, one of the early missionary bishops, who confesses to having burnt a great number of Maya books because they contained nothing but the works of the devil. He fortunately, however, preserved for posterity the alphabet of this people. We present it herewith. Diego de Landa was the first bishop of Yucatan. He wrote a history of the Mayas and their country, which was preserved in manuscript at Madrid in the library of the Royal Academy of History. It contains a description and explanation of the phonetic alphabet of the Mayas. Landa's manuscript seems to have lain neglected in the library, for little or nothing was heard of it until it was discovered by the French priest Brasseur de Bourbourg, who, by means of it, has deciphered some of the old American writings. He says, "The alphabet and signs explained by Landa have been to me a Rosetta Stone." Baldwin's Ancient America, page 191. When we observe, in the table of alphabets of different European nations which I give herewith, how greatly the forms of the Phoenician letters have been modified, it would surprise us to find any resemblance between the Maya alphabet of 2 or 3 centuries since and the ancient European forms. It must, however, be remembered that the Mayas are one of the most conservative peoples in the world. They still adhere with striking pertinacity to the language they spoke when Columbus landed on San Salvador, and it is believed
Still do
that that
today.
language is the same as the one inscribed on the most ancient monuments of their country. Señor Pimental says of them, The Indians have preserved this idiom with such tenacity that they will speak no other. It is necessary for the whites to address them in their own language to communicate with them. It is therefore probable, as their alphabet did not pass from nation to nation, as did the Phoenician, that it has not departed so widely from the original forms received from the Colhuas. But when we consider the vast extent of time which has elapsed, and the fact that we are probably without the intermediate stages of the alphabet which preceded the archaic Phoenician, it will be astonishing if we find resemblances between any of the Maya letters and the European forms, even though we concede that they are related. If we find decided affinities between 2 or 3 letters, we may reasonably presume that similar coincidences existed as to many others which have disappeared under the attrition of centuries. The first thought that occurs to us, on examining the Landa alphabet, is the complex and ornate character of the letters. Instead of the 2 or 3 strokes with which we indicate a sign for a sound, we have here rude pictures of objects, and we find that these are themselves simplifications of older forms, of a still more complex character. Take, for instance, the letter PP in Landa's alphabet, symbol.
So
Here
immature.
are evidently the traces of a face. The same appear, but not so plainly, in the sign for X,
Oh, have
which
they
is
really?
symbol. Now, if we turn to the
this?
ancient hieroglyphics upon the monuments of Central America, we will find the human face appearing in a great many of them, as in the following, which we copy from the tablet of the cross at Palenque. We take the hieroglyphs from the left-hand side of the inscription. Here it will be seen that out of the 7 hieroglyphical figures, 6 contain human faces, and we find that in the whole inscription of the tablet of the cross there are 33 figures out of 108 that are made up in part of the human countenance. We can see, therefore, in the Landa alphabet a tendency to simplification, and this is what we would naturally expect. When the emblems, which were probably first intended for religious inscriptions, where they could be slowly and carefully elaborated, were placed in the hands of a busy, active, commercial people, such as were the Atlanteans, and afterwards the Phoenicians, men with whom time was valuable, the natural tendency would be to simplify and condense them, and when the original meaning of the picture was lost, they would naturally slur it, as we find in the letters PP and X of the Maya alphabet, where the figure of the human face remains only in rude lines. The same tendency is plainly shown in the 2 forms of the letter H, as given in Landa's alphabet. The original form is more elaborate than the variation of it. The original form is symbol. The variation is given as symbol. Now let us suppose this simplification to be carried a step farther. We have seen the upper and lower parts of the first form shrink into a smaller and less elaborate shape. Let us imagine that the same tendency does away with them altogether. We would then have the letter H of the Maya alphabet represented by this figure, symbol. Now, as it takes less time to make a single stroke than a double one, this would become, in time, symbol. We turn now to the archaic Greek and the Old Hebrew, and we find the letter H indicated by the sign symbol. Precisely the Maya letter H simplified. We turn to the archaic Hebrew, and we find it symbol. Now it is known that the Phoenicians wrote from right to
This is
left,
weird
and
to
just as
listen
we,
to
in writing
instead
from
of
left to
read.
right, slope our letters to the right, so did the Phoenicians slope their letters to the left. Hence, the Maya sign becomes in the archaic Phoenician this, symbol. In some of the Phoenician alphabets, we even find the letter H made with the double strokes above and below, as in the Maya H. The Egyptian hieroglyph for H is symbol, while CH is symbol. In time, the Greeks carried the work of simplification still farther, and eliminated the top lines,
It's
as we have
supposed to be a
supposed the
symbol when she's
Atlanteans
saying
to have
symbol.
eliminated the double strokes, and they have left the letter as it has come down to us, H. Now it may be said that all this is coincidence. If it is certainly remarkable. But let us go a step
This
further.
woman needs to know that she can do.
We have
second
seen in
takes.
Landa's alphabet that there are 2 forms of the letter M. The first is symbol. But we find also an M combined with the letter O, A, or E, says Landa, in this form, symbol. The M here is certainly indicated by the central part of this combination, the figure symbol. Where does that come from? It is certainly taken from the heart of the original figure wherein it appears. What does this prove? That the Atlanteans or Mayas, when they sought to simplify their letters and combine them with others, took from the center of the ornate hieroglyphical figure some characteristic mark with which they represented the whole figure. Now let us apply this rule. We have seen in the table of alphabets that in every language from our own day to the time of the Phoenicians, O has been represented by a circle or a circle within a circle. Now where did the Phoenicians get it? Clearly from the Mayas. There are 2 figures for O in the Maya alphabet. They are symbol and symbol. Now, if we apply the rule which we have seen to exist in the case of the Maya M to these figures, the essential characteristic found in each is the circle. In the first case, the pendant from the hieroglyph; in the other, in the center of the lower part of it. And that this circle was withdrawn from the hieroglyph and used alone, as in the case of the M, is proved by the very sign used at the foot of Landa's alphabet, which is symbol. Landa calls this Ma, Me, or Mo. It is probably the latter, and in it we have the circle detached from the hieroglyph. We find the precise Maya O, a circle in a circle, or a dot within a circle, repeated in the Phoenician forms for O, thus symbol and symbol, and by exactly the same forms in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the runic we have the circle in the circle. In one form of the Greek O, the dot was placed alongside of the circle instead of below it, as in the Maya. Are these another set of coincidences? Take another letter. The letter N of the Maya alphabet is represented by this sign, itself probably a simplification of some more ornate form. Symbol. This is something like our letter S, but quite unlike our letter N. But let us examine into the pedigree of our N. We find in the archaic Ethiopian, a language as old as the Egyptian, and which represents the Cushite branch of the Atlantean stock, the sign for N, Na, is symbol. In archaic Phoenician it comes still closer to the S shape, thus symbol, or in this form.
It's free to view. This one is from, I have a weird, I don't have the URL for it, but it is free to view online multiple places. It's open source. Also, please like the video.
Symbol. We have but to curve these angles to approximate it very closely to the Maya N. In Troy, this form was found, symbol. The Samaritan makes it symbol. The Old Hebrew, symbol. The Moab inscription gives it symbol. The later Phoenicians simplified the archaic form still further until it became symbol. Then it passed into symbol. The archaic Greek form is symbol. The later Greeks made N, from which it passed into the present form, N. All these forms seem to be representations of a serpent. We turn to the valley of the Nile, and we find that the Egyptian hieroglyphic for N was the serpent. The Pelasgian N was symbol, the Arcadian symbol, the Etruscan symbol. Can anything be more significant than to find the serpent, the sign for N in Central America and in all these Old World languages? Now turn to the letter K. The Maya sign for K is symbol. This does not look much like our letter K, but let us examine it. Following the precedent established for us by the Mayans in the case of the letter M, let us see what is the distinguishing feature here. It is clearly the figure of a serpent standing erect, with its tail doubled around its middle, forming a circle. It has already been remarked by Savallini that this erect serpent is very much like the Egyptian uraeus, an erect serpent with an enlarged body, a sacred emblem found in the hair of their deities. We turn again to the valley of the Nile, and we find that the Egyptian hieroglyphic for K was a serpent with a convolution or protuberance in the middle, precisely as in the Maya. Thus, symbol. This was transformed into the Egyptian letter symbol. The serpent and the protuberance reappear in one of the Phoenician forms of K, to wit, symbol, while in the Punic we have these forms, symbol and symbol. Now suppose a busy people trying to give this sign, instead of drawing the serpent in all its details, they would abbreviate it into some form like this, symbol. Now we turn to the ancient Ethiopian sign for K, Ku, and we have symbol, or the Himyaritic Arabian, symbol, while in the Phoenician it becomes symbol. In the archaic Greek, symbol, and in the later Greek, when they changed the writing from left to right, kappa. So that the two lines projecting from the upright stroke of our English K are a reminiscence of the convolution of the serpent in the Maya original and the Egyptian copy. Turn now to the Maya sign for T. It is symbol. What is the distinctive mark about this figure? It is the cross composed of two curved lines, thus. It is probable that in this Maya sign the cross is united at the bottom like a figure 8. Here again we turn to the valley of the Nile, and we find that the Egyptian hieroglyph for T is symbol and symbol, and in the Syriac T it is symbol. We even find the curved lines of the Maya T, which give it something of the appearance of the numeral 8, repeated accurately in the Mediterranean alphabets. Thus the Punic T repeats the Maya form almost exactly, as symbol and symbol. Now suppose a busy people compelled to make this mark every day for 1,000 years, and generally in a hurry, and the cross would soon be made without curving the lines. It would become X. But before it reached even that simplified form, it had crossed the Atlantic and appeared in the archaic Ethiopian sign for Tsa, thus, symbol. In the archaic Phoenician, the sign for T is symbol and symbol. The oldest Greek form is symbol or symbol, and the later Greeks gave it to the Romans tau, and modified this into theta. The old Hebrew gave it as symbol and symbol, the Moab stone as symbol. This became in time symbol and symbol.
Gosh, this is
the letter
rough
A.
right now.
In the Maya,
Like,
there are
it's
3
just
forms
saying the
given for
word
this letter.
symbol.
The first is symbol. The third is symbol. The first looks very much like the foot of a lion or tiger. The third is plainly a foot or a boot. If one were required to give hurriedly a rude outline of either of these, would he not represent it thus, symbol? And can we not conceive that this could have in time been modified into the Phoenician A, which was symbol? The hieratic Egyptian A was symbol. The ancient Hebrew, which was...
Yeah, but I think the Scots and the Hittites have like a cultural relation, since they're both Indo-European. I think the Hittites are Indo-European. I'm gonna look it up right now.
symbol or symbol. The ancient Greek was the foot reversed, alpha. The later Greek became our A. Turn next to the Mayan sign for Q, ku. It is symbol. Now, what is the peculiarity of this hieroglyph?
Yeah.
The circle below is not
Indo-European.
significant, for there are many circular figures in the Maya alphabet. Clearly, if one was called upon to simplify this, he would retain the 2 smaller circles joined side by side at the top, and would indicate the lower circle with a line or dash. And when we turn to the Egyptian Q, we find it in this shape.
Right. It's the same relationship you're saying, because they would come from a similar source. Well, I mean, it's, I'd have to look at the amount of similarities, right? Because there can be a certain number of random similarities, but then that are just coincidences. But when it becomes like an overwhelming amount, then it's a different thing. And I don't know if it's at that level, especially because I'm not actually seeing the symbols that they're talking about.
Symbol. We turn to the
Certainly
Ethiopian
not
Q,
impossible,
kua,
like
and we
some
find
people
it
want to pretend
symbol,
it is.
or as qua, symbol, while the Phoenician comes still nearer the supposed Mayan form in symbol. The Moab stone was symbol. The Himyaritic Arabian form became symbol. The Greek form was symbol, which graduated into the Roman Q. But a still more striking proof of the descent of the Phoenician alphabet from the Maya is found in the other form of the Q, the Mayan ku, which is symbol. Now, if we apply the Maya rule to this and discard the outer circle, we have this left, symbol. In time, the curved line would be made straight, and the figure would assume this form, symbol. The next step would be to make the cross on the straight line, thus, symbol. One of the ancient Phoenician forms is symbol. Can this be an accident? The letter C or G, for the 2 probably gave the same sound as in the Phoenician, is given in the Maya alphabet as follows, symbol. This would in time be simplified into a figure representing the 2 sides of a triangle with the apex upward, thus, symbol. This is precisely the form found by Dr. Schliemann in the ruins of Troy, symbol. What is the Phoenician form for G as found on the Moab stone? It is symbol. The Carthaginian Phoenicians gave it a more rounded form, thus, symbol. The hieratic Egyptian form for G was symbol. In the earlier Greek form, the left limb of the figure was shortened, thus, symbol. The later Greeks reversed it and wrote it gamma. The Romans changed this into symbol, and it finally became C. In the Maya, we have one sign for P and another for PP. The first contains a curious figure, precisely like our R laid upon its back.
So stupid.
Symbol. There is apparently no R in the Maya alphabet, and the Roman R grew out of the later Phoenician R, formed thus, symbol. It would appear that the earliest Phoenician alphabet did not contain the letter R. But if we now turn to the Phoenician alphabet, we will find one of the curious forms of the P given thus, symbol, a very fair representation of an R lying upon its face. Is it not another remarkable coincidence that the P in both Maya and Phoenician should contain this singular sign? The form of PP in the Maya alphabet is this symbol. If we are asked, on the principle already indicated, to reduce this to its elements, we would use a figure like this symbol. In time, the tendency would be to shorten one of these perpendicular lines, thus symbol. And this we find is very much like the Phoenician P symbol. The Greek PH is phi. End of chapter 7.
Huh? Oh. What? Did I go to the wrong spot?
Section 23, Part 3, The
Oh,
Civilization of the Old World and New Compared, Chapter 7 of Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly.
I thought it was
This is a
Australian,
LibriVox recording.
but it's
All
not. What is
LibriVox
it?
recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit
It's like
LibriVox.org.
a Filipino that moved to
Atlantis,
Australia or something.
The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 7, The Origin of Our Alphabet. One of the most marvelous inventions for the advancement of mankind is the phonetic alphabet, or a system of signs representing the sounds of human speech. Without it, our present civilization could scarcely have been possible.
Well, it's
No
free.
solution of the origin of our European alphabet has yet been obtained. We can trace it back from nation to nation and form to form until we reach the Egyptians, the archaic forms of Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Cushites, but beyond this, the light fails us. The Egyptians spoke of their own hieroglyphic system of writing not as their own invention, but as the language of the gods.
Yeah,
The
it
Normand
could be.
and Cheval, Ancient History of the East, Volume 2, page 208. The gods were, doubtless, their highly civilized ancestors, the people of Atlantis, who, as we shall hereafter see, became the gods of many of the Mediterranean races. According to the Phoenicians, the art of writing was invented by Tautus or Taut, whom the Egyptians called Thoth, and the Egyptians said it was invented by Thoth or Thoth, otherwise called the first Hermes, which we clearly see that both the Phoenicians and the Egyptians referred the invention to a period older than their own separate political existence, and to an older nation from which both peoples received it. Baldwin's Prehistoric Nations, page 91. The first Hermes, here referred to, afterward called Mercury by the Romans, was a son of Zeus and Maia, a daughter of Atlas. This is the same Maia whom Abbe Brasseur de Bourbourg identifies with the Maya of Central America. Sir William Drummond in his Origines said, "There seems to be no way of accounting either for the early use of letters among so many different nations, or for the resemblance which existed between some of the graphic systems employed by those nations, than by supposing hieroglyphical writing, if I may be allowed the term, to have been in use among the Sabaists in the first ages after the flood, when Sabais and planet worship was the religion of almost every country that was yet inhabited." Sir Henry Rawlinson says, "So great is the analogy between the first principles of the science of writing, as it appears to have been pursued in Chaldea, and as we can actually trace its progress in Egypt, that we can hardly hesitate to assign the original invention to a period before the Hamitic race had broken up and divided. It is not to be believed that such an extraordinary system of sound signs could have been the invention of any one man, or even of any one age. Like all our other acquisitions, it must have been the slow growth and accretion of ages. It must have risen step by step from picture writing through an intermediate condition, like that of the Chinese, where each word or thing was represented by a separate sign. The fact that so old and enlightened a people as the Chinese have never reached the phonetic alphabet gives us some indication of the greatness of the people among whom it was invented, and the lapse of time before they attained to it. Humboldt says, "According to the views which since Champollion's great discovery have been gradually adopted regarding the earlier condition of the development of alphabetical writing, the Phoenicians, as well as Semitic characters, are to be regarded as the phonetic alphabet. that has originated from pictorial writing as one in which the ideal signification of the symbol is wholly disregarded, and the characters are regarded as mere signs for sounds. Cosmos, Volume 2, page 129. Baldwin says, Prehistoric Nations, page 93, the nation that became mistress of the seas established communication with every shore, and monopolized the commerce of the known world, must have substituted a phonetic alphabet for the hieroglyphics, as it gradually grew to this eminence, while so isolated Egypt, less affected by the practical wants and tendencies of commercial enterprise, retained the hieroglyphic system and carried it to a marvelous height of perfection. It must be remembered that some of the letters of our alphabet are inventions of the later nations. In the oldest alphabets there are no C, the G taking its place. The Romans converted the G into C, and then finding the necessity for a G sign, made one by adding a tailpiece to the C. The Greeks added the ancient alphabet and the epsilon, shaped like a V or Y, the two forms being used at first indifferently. They added the X sign, and they converted the T of the Phoenician into TH, or theta, Z and S into signs for double consonants. They turned the Phoenician Y, iota, into I, iota. The Greeks converted the Phoenician alphabet, which was partly consonantal, into one purely phonetic, a perfect instrument for the expression of spoken language. The W was also added to the Phoenician alphabet. The Romans added the Y at first. I and J were both indicated by the same sound. A sign for J was afterward added. We have also, in common with other European languages, added a W, that is V, V, or W, to represent the W sound. The letters, then, which we owe to the Phoenicians are A, B, C, D, E, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, Z. If we are to trace our resemblances with the alphabet of any other country, it must be with these signs.
I can tell, strange.
Is there any other country to which we can turn, which possessed a phonetic alphabet in any respect kindred to this phonetic alphabet? It cannot be the Chinese alphabet, which has more signs than words. It cannot be the cuneiform alphabet of Assyria, with its 700 arrow-shaped characters, none of which bear the slightest affinity to the Phoenician letters.
Already hear this part? Am I
It
crazy?
is a surprising fact that we find in Central America a phonetic alphabet. This is in the alphabet of the Mayas, the ancient people of the peninsula of Yucatan, who claim that their civilization came to them across the sea in ships from the east, that is, from the direction of Atlantis. The Mayas succeeded to the Colhuas, whose era terminated 1,000 years before the time of Christ. From them they received their alphabet. It has come to us through Bishop Lander, one of the early missionary bishops, who confesses to have burnt a great number of Maya books because they contain nothing but the works of the devil. He fortunately, however, preserved for posterity the alphabet of this people. We present it here with Lander's alphabet from North America of Antiquity, page 434. Diego de Landa was the first bishop of Yucatan. He wrote a history of the Maya and their country, which was preserved in manuscript at Madrid in the library of Royal Academy of History. It contains a description and explanation of the phonetic alphabet of the Mayas. Lander's manuscript seems to have lain neglected in the library, for little or nothing was heard of it until it was discovered by the French priest Brasseur de Bourbourg, who by means of it has deciphered some of the old American writings. He says, "The alphabet and signs explained by Lander have been to me a Rosetta Stone." Baldwin's Ancient America, page 191. When we observe in the table of alphabets of different European nations, which I give herewith, how greatly the forms of the Phoenician letters have been modified, it would surprise us to find any resemblance between the Maya alphabet of 2 or 3 centuries since and the ancient European forms. It must, however, be remembered that the Mayas are one of the most conservative peoples in the world. They still adhere with striking pertinacity to the language they spoke when Columbus landed on San Salvador, and it is believed that their language is the same as the one inscribed on the most ancient monuments of their country. Senor Pimentel says of them, "The Indians have preserved this idiom of such tenacity that they will speak no other. It is necessary for the whites to address them in their own language to communicate with them. It is therefore probable, as the alphabet did not pass from nation to nation, as did the Phoenician, that it has not departed so widely from the original.
Okay. This is odd. I'm going to skip forward.
Which is ###. Now, if we apply the Maya rule to this
instead
and
of saying
discard the
thimble,
outside
says
circle,
###.
we have this left ###. In time,
No way. That's terrible. You can't do that, man. But he's reading the same part we already listened to, so we don't have to.
ancient Phoenician inscriptions in the original Maya circles, preserved in making the letter E, thus ###. Then we find the old Greek runes and Phoenician difficult to always keep the baselines horizontal. Naturally, we form something like this ###. The distinctive figure within the sign for M in the Maya is ### or ###. We see this repeated in the Egyptian hieroglyphs
anybody else?
for M ### and ###. And in the Chaldaic M ### and the Ethiopic ###, we find one form of the Phoenician where the M is made thus. Take the letter O, Maya, same sign with very little modification which they had already obtained from the Maya alphabet as the symbol for B. To illustrate this, we place the signs side by side. ###. Thus appears that the very signs D and R in the Phoenician, Early Greek, and Ancient Hebrew, which are lacking in Maya, were supplied by imitating the Maya sign for B. And it is a curious fact that while Phoenician legends claim that Tout invented the art of writing, yet they tell us that Tout made records and delivered them to his successors and to foreigners, to whom one was Osiris, the Egyptian god, the event peculiar country. They came, their legends tell us, from the east and from beyond the sea. And even after the lapse of so many thousand years, most remarkable resemblances have been found to exist between the Chiapenec language and the Hebrew, the living representative of the Phoenician tongue. The Mexican scholar Senor Malga, North Americans of Antiquity, page 475, gives the following list of words taken from the Chiapenec and the Hebrew. The following words shall be read in such a manner:
I don't
English
like his
first,
pronunciation of
Chiapenec
Osiris
second,
either.
Hebrew third. English, son, Chiapenec, bin, Hebrew, ben, daughter, bats, bath, father, abag, abba, star and zodiac, chimax, chima, kin, molo, malok, name applied to Adam, abag, abba. Afflicted, chanam, chanan. To resemblances between the Maya alphabet and the Phoenician alphabet, we find equally surprising coincidences between the Chiapenec tongue, a branch of the Mayas, and the Hebrew, a branch of the Phoenicians. Attempts have been repeatedly made by European scholars to trace the letters of the Phoenician alphabet back to the elaborate hieroglyphics from which all authorities agree, and they must have been developed, but all such attempts have been failures. In the Maya alphabet, we are not only able to extract from the heart of the hieroglyphic the typical sign for the sound, but we are able to go a step farther and by means of the inscriptions upon the monuments of Copan and Palenque, deduce the alphabetical hieroglyph itself from an older and more ornate figure. We thus not only discover the relationship of the European alphabet to the American, but we trace its descent in the very mode in which reason tells us it must have been developed. All this proves that the similarities in question did not come from Phoenicians having accidentally visited the shores of America, but that we have before us the origin, the source, the very matrix in which the Phoenician alphabet was formed. In the light of such a discovery, the inscriptions upon the monuments of Central America assume incalculable importance. They take us back to the civilization far anterior to the oldest known in Europe. They represent the language of antediluvian times. It may be said that it is improbable that the use of an alphabet could have ascended to antediluvian times, or to that prehistoric age when intercourse existed between ancient Europe and America. But it must be remembered that if the flood legends of Europe and Asia are worth anything, they prove that the art of writing existed at the date of the deluge, and that records of antediluvian learning were preserved by those who escaped the flood, while Plato tells us that the people of Atlantis engraved their laws upon columns of bronze and plates of gold. There was a general belief among the ancient nations that the art of writing was known to the antediluvians. The Druids believed in books more ancient than the flood. They styled them the books of Pharalt, and the writings of Pridian and Hu. Ceridwen consults them before she prepares the mysterious cauldron which shadows out the awful catastrophe of the deluge. Faber's Pagan Idolatry, Volume 2, page 150 and 151. In the first avatar of Vishnu, we are told that the divine ordinances were stolen by the demon Hayagriva. Vishnu became a fish, and after the deluge, when the waters had subsided, he recovered the holy books from the bottom of the ocean. Berosus, speaking of the time before the deluge, says, Owens wrote concerning the generations of mankind and their civil polity.
I don't have this part.
The Hebrew commentators on Genesis say,
Or do I?
Our rabbins asserted that Adam, our father of blessed memory, composed a book of precepts which were delivered to him by God in paradise. Smith's Sacred Annals, page 49. That is to say, the Hebrews preserved a tradition that the Ad-Ami, the people of Ad, or Atlantis, possessed while yet dwelling in paradise the art of writing. It has been suggested that without the use of letters, it would have been impossible to preserve the many details as to dates, ages, and measurements as of the ark and handed down to us in Genesis. Josephus, quoting Jewish tradition, says, The births and deaths of illustrious men between Adam and Noah were noted down at the time with great accuracy. Antilib 1 cap 3rd c3. Suidas, a Greek lexicographer of the 11th century, expresses tradition when he says, Adam was the author of arts and letters. The Egyptians said that their god Anubis was an antediluvian, and he wrote annals before the flood. The Chinese have traditions that the earliest race of their nation prior to history taught all the arts of life and wrote books. Goths always had the use of letters, and Lagrange affirms that before or soon after the flood there were found the acts of great men engraved in letters on large stones. Forsbrook's Encyclopedia of Antiquity, Volume 1, page 355. Pliny says, letters were always in use. Strabo says, the inhabitants of Spain possessed records written before the deluge. Jackson's Chronicles of Antiquity, Volume 3, page 85. Mitford, History of Greece, Volume 1, page 121, says, nothing appears to us
My
so
other copy
probable
was
as
better.
that the alphabet,
The whole
was
website's
derived
down.
from the antediluvian world. End of Chapter 7, The Origin of the Alphabet,
The end
of
of-
Section 23 of Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Recording by Pan Nevelander.
Section 24, Part 3, Chapter 8 of Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Apfelstadt. Atlantis the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 3, Chapter 8, The Bronze Age in Europe. There exists in Europe the evidences of three different ages of human development. 1. The Stone Age, which dates back to a vast antiquity. It is subdivided into two periods, an age of rough stone implements, and a later age when these implements were ground smooth and made in improved forms. 2. The Bronze Age, when the great mass of implements were manufactured of a compound metal consisting of about 9 parts of copper and 1 part of tin. 3. An age when iron superseded bronze for weapons and cutting tools, although bronze still remained in use for ornaments. This age continued down to what we call the historical period and embraces our present civilization. Its more ancient remains are mixed with coins of the Gauls, Greeks, and Romans. The Bronze Period has been one of the perplexing problems of European scientists. Articles of bronze are found over nearly all that continent, but in especial abundance in Ireland and Scandinavia. They indicate very considerable refinement and civilization upon the part of the people who made them, and a wide diversity of opinion has prevailed as to who that people were and where they dwelt. In the first place, it was observed that the age of bronze, a compound of copper and tin, must, in the natural order of things, have been preceded by an age when copper and tin were used separately, before the ancient metallurgists had discovered the art of combining them. And yet in Europe the remains of no such age have been found. Sir John Lubbock says, Prehistoric Times, page 59, "The absence of implements made either of copper or tin seems to me to indicate that the art of making bronze was introduced into, not invented in, Europe." The absence of articles of copper is especially marked. Nearly all the European specimens of copper implements have been found in Ireland, and yet out of 1,283 articles of the Bronze Age in the Great Museum at Dublin, only 30 celts and 1 sword blade are said to be made of pure copper, and even as to some of these there seems to be a question. Where on the face of the earth are we to find a copper age? Is it in the barbaric depths of that Asia out of whose uncivilized tribes all civilization is said to have issued? By no means. Again, we are compelled to turn to the West. In America, from Bolivia to Lake Superior, we find everywhere the traces of a long-enduring copper age. Bronze existed, it is true, in Mexico, but it held the same relation to the copper as copper held to the bronze in Europe. It was the exception as against the rule. And among the Chippeways on the shores of Lake Superior, and among them alone, we find any traditions of the origin of the manufacture of copper implements. And on the shores of that lake we find pure copper, out of which the first metal tools were probably hammered before man had learned to reduce the ore or run the metal into molds. And on the shores of the same American lake we find the ancient mines from which some people, thousands of years ago, derived their supplies of copper. Implements and ornaments of the Bronze Age. Sir W. R. Wilde says, "It is remarkable that so few antique copper implements have been found in Europe, although a knowledge of that metal must have been the preliminary stage in the manufacture of bronze."
What is that voice?
He thinks that this may be accounted for by supposing that but a short time elapsed between the knowledge of smelting and casting copper ore and the introduction of tin and the subsequent manufacture and use of bronze. But here we have in America the evidence that thousands of years must have elapsed during which copper was used alone, before it was discovered that by adding 1/10 part of tin it gave a harder edge and produced a superior metal. The Bronze Age cannot be attributed to the Roman civilization. Sir John Lubbock shows, Prehistoric Times, page 21, that bronze weapons have never been found associated with Roman coins or pottery, or other remains of the Roman period. That bronze articles have been found in the greatest abundance in countries like Ireland and Denmark, which were never invaded by Roman armies, and that the character of the ornamentation of the works of bronze is not Roman in character, and that the Roman bronze contained a large proportion of lead, which is never the case in that of the Bronze Age. It has been customary to assume that the Bronze Age was due to the Phoenicians, but of late the highest authorities have taken issue with this opinion. Sir John Lubbock, Ibid, page 73, gives the following reasons why the Phoenicians could not have been the authors of the Bronze Age. First, the ornamentation is different. In the Bronze Age, this always consisted of geometrical figures, and we rarely, if ever, find upon them representations of animals and plants. While on the ornamented shields, etc., described by Homer, as well as in the decoration of Solomon's temple, Animals and plants were abundantly represented. The cuts on page 242 will show the character of the ornamentation of the Bronze Age. In the next place, the form of burial is different in the Bronze Age from that of the
that's a good point,
Phoenicians.
Squid.
In the third place, the Phoenicians, so far as we know them, were well acquainted with the use of iron. In Homer we find the warriors already armed with iron weapons, and the tools used in preparing the materials for Solomon's temple were of this metal.
He's so wrong. For
This view is also held by Monsieur de Fallenberg in the Bulletin de la Société des Sciences of Bern. See Smithsonian Rep. 1865-66, page 383. He says, Ornaments of the Bronze Age. It seems surprising that the nearest neighbors of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Etruscans, and the Romans, should have manufactured plumbiferous bronzes, while the Phoenicians carried to the people of the north only pure bronzes without the alloy of lead. If the civilized people of the Mediterranean added lead to their bronzes, it can scarcely be doubted that the calculating Phoenicians would have done as much.
I really
And
want to
at
get
least
inside
with
this guy's
distant
head.
and half-civilized tribes have replaced the more costly tin by the cheaper metal. On the whole, then, I consider that the first knowledge of bronze may have been conveyed to the
Sounds like a
populations of the
bad
period
cartoon
in review,
character.
not only by the Phoenicians, but by other civilized people dwelling more to the southeast. Professor E. de
Yeah, Mike
Sor,
Harris
in
and
his
the French
work
lady were
on
really
the
good.
equestrian constructions of the lake of
obviously
Neuchâtel,
it's kind of
says,
it was
the Phoenicians
it's a
certainly
nice
knew of
feminine
the use
voice,
of
but
iron,
also
and it can scarcely
legitimately
be
good.
conceived why they should have excluded it from their commerce on the Scandinavian coasts.
Dude.
The Etruscans, moreover, were acquainted with the
I'm
use
not
of
even paying
iron
attention
as
to what
well
he's
as
saying.
the Phoenicians,
This
and
is
it has
so
already been
distracting.
seen that the composition of their bronzes is different, since it contained lead, which is entirely a
He
stranger
doesn't
to our bronze
sound like
epoch.
the type of guy who would do this
We
as a
must
joke,
look
but
then
it
beyond the
seems like a
Etruscans
joke.
and the Phoenicians in attempting to identify the commerce of the Bronze Age of our Palafites. It will be the province of the historian to inquire whether, exclusive of the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, there may not have been some maritime and commercial people who carried on a traffic through the ports of Liguria with the populations of the Age of Bronze of the lakes of Italy before the discovery of iron. We may remark in passing that there is nothing to prove that the Phoenicians were the first navigators. History, on the contrary, positively mentions prisoners under the name of Tokhari, who were vanquished in a naval battle fought by Ramses III in the 13th century before our era, and whose physiognomy, according to Morton, would indicate the Celtic type. Now there is room to suppose that if these Tokhari were energetic enough to measure their strength on the sea with one of the powerful kings of Egypt, they must, with stronger reason, have been in a condition to carry on a commerce along the coasts of the Mediterranean and perhaps of the Atlantic. If such a commerce really existed before the time of the Phoenicians, it would not be limited to the southern slope of the Alps. It would have extended also to the people of the Age of Bronze in Switzerland. The introduction of the Age of Bronze would thus ascend to a very high antiquity, doubtless beyond the limits of the most ancient European races. For the merchants of the Bronze Age, we must look beyond even the Tokhari, who were contemporaries of the Phoenicians. The Tokhari, we have seen, are represented as taken prisoners in a sea fight with Ramses III of the 20th dynasty about the 13th century B.C. They are probably the Tokhari of Strabo. The accompanying figure represents one of these people as they appeared upon the Egyptian monuments. See Knott and Gliddon's Types of Mankind, page 108. Here we have, not an inhabitant of Atlantis, but probably a representative of one of the mixed races that sprung from its colonies. Dr. Morton thinks these people, as painted on the Egyptian monuments, to have strong Celtic features. Those familiar with the Scotch Highlanders may recognize a speaking likeness. It is at least interesting to have a portrait of one of the daring race who more than 3,000 years ago left the west of Europe in their ships to attack the mighty power of Egypt. They were troublesome to the nations of the East for many centuries.
Just like an
For in
archaeologist who
700
hates this
BC,
book and
we
he wanted
find
to
them
mock it.
depicted on the Assyrian monuments. This figure represents one of the Tokhari at the time of Sennacherib. It will be observed that the headdress, apparently of feathers, is the same in both portraits, although separated by a period of 600 years. It is more reasonable to suppose that the authors of the Bronze Age of Europe were the people described by Plato, who were workers in metal, who were highly civilized, who preceded in time all the nations which we call ancient. It was this people who passed through an age of copper before they reached the age of bronze, and whose colonies in America represented this older form of metallurgy as it existed for many generations. Professor Desor says, "We are asked if the preparation of bronze was not an indigenous invention which had originated on the slope of the Alps."
I mean,
In this
honestly, I do think that he's being serious. As bad as that sounds, this doesn't seem like the type of thing that somebody would play a joke on, although it'd be funny if they did.
We acquiesced
It's
for
like
a
a
moment,
big
but we
commitment.
are met by the objection that, if this were so, the natives, like the ancient tribes of America, would have commenced by manufacturing utensils of copper. Yet thus far no utensils of this metal have been found, except a few in the strand of Lake Garda. The great majority of metallic objects is of bronze, which necessitated the employment of tin, and this could not be obtained except by commerce, inasmuch as it is a stranger to the Alps. It would appear, therefore, more natural to admit that the art of combining tin with copper, in other words, that the manufacture of bronze, was of foreign importation. He then shows that, although copper ores are found in the Alps, the probability is that even the copper also was of foreign importation. Now, in view of the prodigious quantities of bronze manufactured at that epoch, this single branch of commerce must itself have necessitated the most incessant commercial communications.
Yeah.
And as this commerce could not, as we have seen, been carried on by the Romans, Greeks, Etruscans, or Phoenicians, because their civilizations flourished during the Iron Age, to which this age of bronze was anterior, where
didn't know
then
that.
are we to look for a great maritime and commercial people who carried vast quantities of copper, tin, and bronze, unalloyed by the lead of the south of Europe, to Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, England, France, Spain, Switzerland, and Italy? Where can we find them save in that people of Atlantis, whose ships, docks, canals, and commerce provoked the astonishment of the ancient Egyptians, as recorded by Plato? The Toltec root for water is atol. The Peruvian word for copper is anti, from which, probably, the Andes derived their name, as there was a province of Anti on their slopes. May it not be that the name of Atlantis is derived from these originals, and signified the copper island, or the copper mountains in the sea? And from these came the thousands of tons of copper and tin that must, during the Bronze Age, have been introduced into Europe? There are no ancient works to indicate that the tin mines of Cornwall were worked for any length of time in the early days. See Prehistoric Times, page 74. Morlot has pointed out that the bronze implements of Hallstatt in Austria were of foreign origin because they contained no lead or silver. Or, if we are to seek for the source of the vast amounts of copper brought into Europe somewhere else than in Atlantis, may it not be that these supplies were drawn in large part from the shores of Lake Superior in America? The mining operations of some ancient people were there carried on upon a gigantic scale, not only along the shores of the lake, but even far out upon its islands. At Isle Royale, vast works were found, reaching to a depth of 60 feet. Great intelligence was shown in following up the richest veins, even when interrupted. The excavations were drained by underground drains. On 3 sections of land on this island, the amount of mining exceeded that mined in 20 years in one of our largest mines, with a numerous force constantly employed. In one place,
Yeah. No, you're right. It's fun to do, but these are obviously people volunteering their time for a very good project that's like providing a service for everybody. I'm sorry guys, I'm not feeling very good, so I'm gonna cut this off here and I will be back later on this. I'm sorry to do that so abruptly, but I'm starting to feel a little sick. So I'll be back. Check out the podcast, like the video, and we'll finish this out eventually. It'll take a while, but we'll do it.